You probably know that the Kansas City Chiefs won Super Bowl 58 in 2024, their second in a row. But did you know that the team's home games aren't actually played in Kansas? Their home, Arrowhead Stadium, is actually in Kansas City, Missouri, not Kansas City, in the actual state of Kansas. And speaking of Missouri, did you know that the Show Me State is home to the longest river in the US? Despite the popular misconception that the Mississippi River is the longest, it's actually the Missouri River that claims this flattering title, stretching an impressive 2,341 miles. That's barely 1 mile longer than the Mississippi, but hey, a win is a win. These are just 2 US geography facts that most people get wrong. Think you know your stuff? Brace yourself for another rapid-fire 48 mind-blowing geography facts. Fact number 48. Alaska isn't the least populous state in the US. Alaska might be the least densely populated US state, but the title of the least populous state actually belongs to Wyoming, with about 580,000 residents compared to Alaska's 730,000. Fact number 47. Not all 50 US states observe daylight saving time. You know that pesky time change that messes with your sleep schedule twice a year? Not everyone in the US has to deal with it. While the rest of us are busy springing forward and falling back, folks in Hawaii and Arizona, except for the Navajo Nation, can enjoy a more constant sleep routine year-round. Fact number 46. Washington, D.C. wasn't America's first capital. Now we know what you're thinking. Duh, it was in Philadelphia. Nope, the U.S.'s first capital was actually New York City. It was in this bustling city that the first U.S. president, George Washington, took the oath of office. You knew that one? Okay, we'll see how you do with this next one. Fact number 45. A fragment of Africa lies beneath the US. That's right. You might think you're living in the southeastern US, but you might very well be standing on a piece of Africa, stuck there after millions of years of geological shifts. Fact number 44. You can see Russia from Alaska. Though this fact has been debated extensively, you can actually see Russia from Alaska, thanks to the Cape Prince of Wales, which is only about 50 miles away from mainland Siberia. Fact number 43. There are only 2 Caribbean islands under US sovereignty. There are over 7,000 Caribbean islands, but the US only has sovereignty over 2, Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. Ready for the next one? Fact number 42, you could fit the world's entire population within the borders of Texas. Yes, Texas is really that massive. And no, we aren't talking about almost 8 billion people living comfortably inside the almost 270,000 square mile land area. We're only saying that they could all technically fit. Fact number 41. Texas isn't the largest US state. Now, this one might outright shock you. The Lone Star State is only the second largest US state. In terms of sheer landmass, Alaska takes the crown, dwarfing Texas by a considerable margin. At around 660,000 square miles, Alaska is more than 2 times larger than Texas. Okay, you probably knew that one. But how about this? Fact number 40. The 4 largest US cities are in Alaska. New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago might be the largest US cities by population, but Sitka, Juneau, Wrangell, and Anchorage are the largest by area, and they're all in Alaska. Fact number 39. The US is home to the shortest river in the world. From the tallest mountain to the shortest river, the tiny Roe River is only about 200 feet long and is located in Montana. It's all about balance. Fact number 38. The US features a mountain higher than Mount Everest. At just over 29,000 feet, Mount Everest is officially the world's highest mountain. But that's just above sea level. If you measure from base to summit, Hawaii's 33,500-foot tall Mauna Kea is higher. Fact number 37. The largest distance between any 2 points in US territory is almost 10,000 miles. Set off on a journey from Point Udall, Guam to Point Udall, St. Croix in the US Virgin Islands, and you'll need to travel around 9,500 miles. That's almost the same as traveling from New York City to Sydney, Australia. Fact number 36. Route 66 isn't the longest US highway. Route 66 might be the most iconic highway in the US, but it isn't the longest. That honor belongs to US Route 20, which spans around 3,365 miles from Boston, Massachusetts to Newport, Oregon. Fact number 35. Alaska is both the westernmost and easternmost US state. Alaska is quite clearly the westernmost state in the US, extending far into the Pacific Ocean. Ocean. But thanks to its Aleutian Islands, which stretch across the 180th meridian, the last frontier also houses the US's most extreme eastern point. Sorry, Maine. Fact number 34. Maine is the closest US state to Africa. Don't feel too sorry about Maine, as the Pine Tree State has a fascinating fact of its own. Quoddy Head is only 3,150 miles away from the El Bedouza commune in Morocco, allowing Maine to hold the distinction of being the closest US state to the African continent. Fact number 33, Maine isn't as far north as most people believe. Compared to the rest of the US, Maine is pretty far up north, but a large chunk of Europe, including the UK and parts of Scandinavia, extend farther north than Maine. Fact number 32. All cardinal directions from Stamford, Connecticut lead to New York. Yep, whether you opt to travel north, south, west, or sail east in this fine town in Connecticut, you'll end up in the state of New York. Fact number 31. Florida isn't the southernmost US state. If you've ever traveled to Key West, you might have thought you were at the southernmost point of the US. But really, the true southernmost point of the entire US is in Hawaii, only about 1,500 miles from the equator, and it's called Kalai. Fact number 30. Certain parts of Nevada extend further west than Los Angeles. Los Angeles is often considered a quintessential West Coast city. You might be surprised to learn that the city of Reno in Nevada is roughly 86 miles farther west than the City of Angels. Fact number 29, Los Angeles used to have a much longer name. Speaking of the City of Angels, it wasn't always called Los Angeles. It was originally known as, and hang with me here, El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de Los Ángeles de Rio de Posiúncula. That's quite a mouthful. Fact number 28. Hawaii edges closer to Alaska every year. Every year, Hawaii moves northwest towards Alaska at a rate of about 3 inches. Unfortunately, that rate means that none of us will live long enough to see these two meet. But don't worry, the US states that actually do meet are still full of fascinating geographical quirks. Fact number 27. Only one US state is triply landlocked. Not only does Nebraska lack any ocean coastline, but it's also entirely surrounded by other landlocked states. In other words, to reach an ocean, you would have to pass through at least 3 other states, regardless of which direction you take. Fact number 26. Despite being landlocked, Wyoming has islands. Wyoming might be landlocked, but this fact doesn't stop the cowboy state from having at least 30 named islands located in its many lakes. Fact number 25. 2 US states don't share borders with any other US state. Landlocked, double landlocked, triple landlocked? Hawaii and Alaska can't relate. These 2 US states are the only ones that don't share borders with any other state. Fact number 24. Missouri and Tennessee share their borders with the highest number of US states. That's right, Missouri and Tennessee are true border hoppers, each sharing boundaries with a whopping 8 states. Talk about mixing and mingling. Fact number 23. The US borders 3 oceans. Most people know that the US borders the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, but did you know that it also touches the Arctic Ocean? Alaska's northern coastline is the one adding a chilly third ocean to the mix. It's about time for us to shift focus to hit you with some fun and unexpected US city facts. Fact number 22. Orlando isn't the capital of Florida. Orlando might have the fame and the theme parks, but it doesn't have the title of Florida's capital city. This honor goes to Tallahassee, which is located in the state's panhandle. Fact number 21. Anchorage is quite a global hub. Despite its remote location, Anchorage is a major hub for international cargo, especially because it sits halfway between major markets like Asia and North America. Fact number 20. 34 US states have a city or a town named Springfield. Some might believe the common factoid saying that every US state has a city or a town called Springfield, while others might think there's only one Springfield, famously known as the home of The Simpsons. Either way, you're in for a surprise. Fact number 19. The smallest incorporated town in the US only has 1 resident. When you hear the phrase a small town, you might think of charming communities with a few hundred residents, but the population of the smallest incorporated town in the US, Monowi, Nebraska, is exactly 1 person. Fact number 18. The US has 2 state capitals that rhyme. Here's a silly geographical fact to shake things up. Boston and Austin are the only 2 US state capitals with rhyming names. Let's keep the fun going. Fact number 17. The state of Colorado isn't shaped like a square. Don't let the maps fool you. Colorado has a much more complex shape, one that has as many as 697 sides. That's a hexaheptaenneaconticaheptagon for you geometry buffs out there. Fact number 16. The US has a large appetite. On average, Americans tend to eat about 100 acres of pizza each day. But there's more, around 20 billion hot dogs and 50 billion hamburgers a year. That's a lot of fast food. Fact number 15. You can walk from Alaska to Russia. Not only can you see Russia from Alaska, but you can also walk to it. This daring 2.4-mile trek could only be possible during the winter months when the Bering Strait freezes over. Ready for another rapid-fire round? This time of unique US state characteristics. Fact number 14. Kentucky boasts more caves than any other location in the world. The largest cave system on Earth is located in the Bluegrass State, and around 430 out of the estimated 600 miles have been explored. Fact number 13. Only 2 US states can grow coffee. Bad news for all the caffeine enthusiasts. Only Hawaii and California can grow the beans for this beloved beverage. So if you're craving a local taste of American-grown coffee, you'll need to head to these sunny locales. Fact number 12. You can drive on the left side of the road in the US. Move over, Britain. The US Virgin Islands have got you covered with left side driving. But most cars in the USVI are imported from the mainland US, meaning their steering wheel is also on the left side. Fact number 11. Alaska has the longest coastline in the US. Alaska is the reigning champion of national coastlines, with around 6,660 miles in total, more than every other US state combined. Fact number 10. Alaska also has the most earthquakes in the US. Thanks to its position on one of the world's fastest-moving underwater tectonic faults, Alaska has an average of 1,000 earthquakes per month. Fact number 9. California rivals Canada in terms of population. California's population is almost as large as that of the entire country of Canada. With over 39.1 million residents, California is a mega-state that only trails a few 100,000 people behind Canada. Let's list a few quick US geography facts in the traditional sense of the word. Fact number 8. The western parts of the US used to have enormous lakes. Over 20,000 years ago, states like Nevada, Utah, and Oregon used to contain massive bodies of water that could rival the Great Lakes. Fact number 7. The 5 Great Lakes are technically only 4. Lake Michigan and Lake Huron are connected, making the total number of the Great Lakes 4 instead of 5. Fact number 6. The distance between the highest and lowest point in the contiguous US is under 100 miles. You can stand at the peak of Mount Whitney in California, the highest point in the contiguous US at almost 14,500 feet, and then travel to Death Valley's Badwater Basin, the lowest point at around 280 feet below sea level, and cover that entire distance in roughly 80 miles. Fact number 5. There's a tiny portion of the Appalachian Range located in France. The Appalachian Range formed before North America broke away from Europe, so French people could call themselves hillbillies if they like. Fact number 4. Mount Whitney isn't the highest mountain in the US. At 14,505 feet, Mount Whitney is the tallest mountain in the contiguous US. But the entire US? That honor belongs to Alaska's Denali, formerly known as Mount McKinley, at just over 20,300 feet. There are only 3 facts left on our list. Let's wrap it up with a bang. Fact number 3. Only 2 US states have never recorded a temperature over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. One is obvious, Alaska. However, the other one might shock you. Since it became a state, Hawaii, the land of volcanoes and tropical breezes, has never seen temperatures climb above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Fact number 2. Dozens of buildings in New York City have their own zip codes. Over 40 skyscrapers in New York City, including the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building, are so large that they can boast their own unique zip code. And finally, fact number 1, the Statue of Liberty isn't in New York. If you live in New York or New Jersey, you've probably had this argument a million times. The Statue of Liberty might be the most iconic symbol of the Big Apple, but it geographically resides in New Jersey's waters. And there you have it. 50 US geography facts that tend to surprise or outright shock most people. How many of them did you already know? And which two were your favorite or surprised you the most? Leave us a comment down below. And make sure to subscribe to our channel for more fun videos and check out the ones we've previously put out. Thanks for watching, and as always, take care out there. The United States of America possesses 3.797 million square miles of diverse territories, lending astounding levels of diversity from one state to the next. But for every beautiful landmark the US has to offer, there's something downright strange just around the corner. Locations that would make any traveler, or even a native, question exactly how it all came to be. In this video, we'll be taking a look at 25 of the country's geographic oddities that continue to befuddle the average Americanophile, yes, that's a real word, as well as the reason they stand today. Have you ever noticed this disconnected piece of Minnesota? Known as the Northwest Angle, it is one of only 6 non-island hotspots identified as practical exclaves, a part of one country that can only be entered via land route by passing through another country, which in this case is Canada. The area of this chimney is approximately 596.3 miles, with 473.2 miles of that being water. Additionally, it is the northernmost point of the contiguous 48 states. So how did this territory, that requires Canadian approval to drive there, end up being a piece of the United States? Well, it came about from a misunderstanding of the region's geography. According to historians, Benjamin Franklin and British representatives relied on the Mitchell map, which did not indicate the source of the Mississippi River, thought to lie some distance to the northwest, or the true shape of the Lake of the Woods, which was instead shown as roughly oval. During future treaties, such as the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, the British suggested carving out a new boundary to run west of Lake Superior to Lake Itasca, the actual headwaters of Mississippi. Unfortunately, at this point in time, the love of expansion was already a part of the US's modus operandi, and there was no way they would consider giving up land, as there was a fear that this would set a precedent for all future negotiations. So the Northwest Angle, or simply Angle, as the locals call it, is here to stay. Our next stop is this town here, Carter Lake. At first glance, you'd probably assume this is just another Nebraskan town that lies near the border of Iowa. But the reality is, it's actually a part of Iowa. But unlike the Northwest Angle, which is clearly separated from the rest of Minnesota by water, why is this town an exclave of Iowa? The lake to the north, from which the town gets its name, was born in 1877 after a flood changed the course of the Missouri River 1¼ miles to the southeast. The development led to an arduous litigation process between Iowa and Nebraska, where the Supreme Court ruled that Carter Lake belonged to Iowa. What makes this so unique is that this defies the general rule that state boundaries follow the changes in the river. As a result, in July 1930, Carter Lake was incorporated as a city, hosting 2 amusement parks in the early 20th century, as well as becoming a place to gamble in the 30s and 40s with limited law enforcement. Thanks, Mother Nature. Now, quick, let me ask you this. Which US state is closest to Africa? Most map enthusiasts might assume that it's Florida, about 4,085 miles from Gujarat. On top of that, Florida's climate just makes you think that it would have to be Africa's closest oceanic neighbor in the States. Alas, you would be wrong. It actually happens to be Maine. More specifically, a peninsula in the state known as Quoddy Head, which sounds like something out of Moby Dick. This little lighthouse settlement is at the easternmost point in the US, 3,154 miles from El Bedouza, a rural commune in Morocco, just over 900 miles closer than Florida. Known for its rocky coastline and lobster shacks, the cool state of Maine seems like an odd location to be closest to the cradle of civilization, and yet, here we are. Just south of Maine, we arrive at New York City, which has a rather unique governmental structure. As you may know, New York City is made up of 5 boroughs. For the uninitiated, these boroughs are titled Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island. Each borough is also equal to the county boundaries of the same name. This group of counties cover a relatively small 322 square miles of land, and yet each of these societal pockets possesses its own class system and culture. Manhattan acts as the seat of wealth, housing most of the territory's skyscrapers, multinational corporations, Wall Street, and the headquarters of the UN. Brooklyn, on the western tip of Long Island, is the most populated out of the five, and known for its diversity and thriving art scene. Queens is the largest of them all. Founded by the Dutch, it has reached major commercial success, inspiring countless TV shows and movies. The Bronx is home to Yankee Stadium and home to the largest metropolitan zoo in the world. Lastly, Staten Island boasts unobstructed views of the Statue of Liberty along 28 miles of trails and the Greenbelt. But the strange thing about this layout is that the government of New York City as an entity supersedes the authority of each individual county. So while county leadership would supersede a city in the other 49 states, New York City is the exception. Traveling to the Midwest, take a look at the Missouri Boot Heel, a salient or elongated protrusion that makes it look like Missouri has begun leaking into Arkansas. The rest of Missouri's southern border is a straight line. So what happened here? Up until the 20th century, the district was utilized for wheat and was full of family farms, until the invasion of the notorious boll weevil, a beetle that decimated the territory and sent everyone packing. Surprisingly, this little piece of land was home to a number of Civil War battles too, and was a hotbed for civil rights conflicts during the 1910s. But originally, the Missouri Boot Heel wasn't supposed to be included as part of Missouri. During the formation of the Missouri Compromise, the original border was supposed to be a simple extension connected to Kentucky and Tennessee. But a man by the name of John Hardman Walker didn't like the sound of that idea. He had grown up in the territory, and after many had fled following the New Madrid earthquakes in 1811, Walker continued to buy land to expand his cattle business. This led to him eventually being known as the Czar of the Valley. By 1818, Congress was brought into a dialogue with Walker and the local residents. Walker, who preferred the area and his holdings to be under the protection of Missouri state laws, lobbied in Missouri and Washington, D.C. for inclusion of the Boot Heel within the boundaries of the state of Missouri. On March 6, 1820, the Missouri Territory requested admission into the Union with the modified boundary. The request was accepted and increased the total area of Missouri by 980 square miles. Going from one salient to another, it's time to talk about another iconic geographical oddity, the Florida Panhandle. Bordering Alabama at about 200 miles in length, this panhandle is one of only 8 that can be found in the United States. The 10 counties that inhabit the space are not only separated culturally, with French influence being a common theme, but they inhabit a separate time zone from the rest of the state, using Central Time. Well, except Gulf County, which is split in two by the Central and Eastern time zones. But how did the Florida Panhandle come into existence, and why wasn't it just included as part of Alabama? The journey started in 1811, while the Panhandle was still a part of Spain. But American settlers in the territory found themselves closely identifying with the U.S. and sent a petition to Congress asking to be incorporated into the Mississippi Territory. But this more or less fell on deaf ears. In 1819, the Constitutional Convention of Alabama asked to join what was then known as West Florida to the new state. Again, no such luck. Finally, in 1821, Spain decided it was in their best interest to sell the territory. At that point, the Panhandle counties finally became a part of Florida, which was admitted as a state in 1845. Quite the roller coaster, but here it stands today. Geography has its high points and low points. In this case, literally and figuratively. Another fascinating oddity lies in the state of California. California is one of the few places where 5 major climate types occur in close proximity. Here, the desert, cool interior, highland, and steppe climates border a smaller region of Mediterranean climate. Half of all produce comes from the state's varietal landscape, so it may come as no surprise that there are many peaks and valleys to visit as a traveler. In this particular instance, the peak we're talking about today is Mount Whitney, a 14,505-foot monster of a mountain and the culminating summit of the Sierra Nevadas. Its neighbor, sitting only 85 miles apart from the high peak, is the Badwater Basin in Death Valley, sitting at 282 feet below sea level. What makes this fascinating, or odd, is that these are the highest and lowest points of the contiguous United States. The country is about 3,000 miles wide, so the fact that Mount Whitney and Badwater sit so close to each other is one of the craziest natural coincidences on this list. Across the US, there's a clear hierarchy with the government. You have cities that are part of counties, which make up states, which fall under the federal government in DC. So it may surprise some to know that one state decided this hierarchy didn't apply to them. That state is Virginia. But why? Well, it's a fairly complicated matter that can be traced back to the time of the colonies, when the British were trying to encourage the creation of towns in order to better extract taxes from their subjects. It was a feudal gesture, and Virginia's General Assembly held numerous meetings in an attempt to resolve the issue in later years. The issue often stemmed from a lack of population density. Finally, after World War I, Alexandria County was the first in Virginia to have sufficient population density for local officials to provide public services equivalent to towns and cities. The Supreme Court of Appeals ruled in 1922 that towns could not be created in Arlington County, and its territory could not be annexed by the adjacent city of Alexandria. So, Arlington County was to be treated as an independent city, and it was the first county in the United States to adopt the county manager form of government. Fast forward to the present day, and many Virginia cities statewide are completely separate from counties when it comes to jurisdiction. City residents resolve legal disputes in separate courts from county residents. Cities and counties have separate land use and transportation plans, and in almost every case, separate school systems as well. In the end, Virginia was going to do it their own way. Moving further south, Texas is another member of the United States that definitely marches to the beat of its own drum. As the second largest member of the Union, it spans 268,596 square miles, nearly 3 times bigger than the whole of the UK. Formerly a part of Mexico, Texas had actually become an independent country in 1836, leaving it quite a bit of time to develop its own identity until it joined the US in 1845. From rodeos to 10-gallon hats to its iconic Lone Star flag, Texas's presence looms so large that many on the outside believe Texans and Americans in general are one and the same. All of this aside, although many see Texas as the champion of the South, some might be astonished to know just how South Texas actually is. In fact, if you look at a map of deep South Texas, you'll see its southernmost point dips almost as low as Miami. The port of Brownsville is almost a straight shot to the party capital, about 1,029 nautical miles through the Gulf of Mexico. At number 10, we'll be looking at another natural wonder, Crater Lake. Located in south-central Oregon, this volcanic crater lake is famous for its aesthetic alone, drawing in a number of cross-country enthusiasts with its rich blue color and up-close clarity. No rivers flow in or out of it, and it makes up for any loss of water through rainfall or snowmelt. It also houses 2 small islands, uniquely named Wizard Island, a 316-acre cinder cone, and a natural rock pillar called Phantom Ship. These facts are enough to catch one's attention, but the oddity lies in Crater Lake's depth. Although the body of water is only about 5 to 6 miles across, its maximum depth is 1,949 feet, making it the deepest lake in all of the United States. Excluding Lake Vostok in Antarctica, Crater Lake is cited as the 7th deepest lake on the planet. All of this is the product of volcanic activity from Mount Mazama. It's estimated that about 720 years was required to fill the lake to its present depth of 1,949 feet. Much of this occurred during a period when the prevailing climate was less moist than at present. Some hydrothermal activity remains along the lake floor, suggesting that at some time in the future, Mazama may erupt once again. With that said, Crater Lake is not the only mover and shaker on this list. When thinking about earthquakes, we often jump to highlighting activity on the West Coast in places like California. After all, there was a shock on April 10, 1906, off the Northern California coast that smashed City Hall and triggered a fire that scorched 28,000 buildings with a death toll that may have exceeded 3,000. For these reasons, many reasonably assume that the San Andreas Fault is an apocalyptic concern, inspiring a number of films like 2012 starring John Cusack. Believe it or not, the two biggest earthquakes in recorded US history, outside of Alaska, occurred far, far away from the San Andreas Fault. They actually took place in Missouri and South Carolina. Known as the New Madrid earthquakes, named after the New Madrid seismic zone, which was in turn named after the Mississippi River town of New Madrid. There was a series of quakes that occurred between 1811 and 1812. The first one hit a recorded magnitude of 7.2 to 8.2. At the time, their area was sparsely populated, so it didn't have the same effect as what took place in California. The last quake packed quite the punch though, shaking at a magnitude of 7.4 to 8.6. The town of New Madrid was destroyed. In St. Louis, Missouri, many houses were severely damaged and their chimneys were toppled. To this day, many eastern residents are warned that such an earthquake could come again in the next 50 or so years. Cleansing our palates, it's time to look at another panhandle. If you look closely at the northwest corner of the panhandle where Texas joins Oklahoma and New Mexico, you'll notice that the lines aren't perfectly aligned. After going down the edge of Oklahoma, the border goes 2.3 miles to the left before continuing in a straight line south. A couple miles is no big deal, right? Well, this is often referred to as the worst surveying error in United States history. Let's get a bit deeper here. This error actually goes far beyond the previously cited 2.3 miles. It actually gets bigger as it continues south, 310 miles to the bottom Texas-New Mexico corner, where it turns west and heads for El Paso. All totaled, the mistake accounts to a 942 square mile hiccup. To add insult to injury, all of this land should have technically gone to New Mexico. So, what happened? Well, in 1859, a man named John H. Clark was paid to survey and install monuments along what is called the 103rd Meridian, which aligns with where we see Oklahoma's border meet New Mexico today. Clark began on the southern end of today's Texas and New Mexico border, and made his way northward until he no longer had a water source. Sounds reasonable enough, but there was a small problem on top of this problem. While connecting the lines, he was frightened by the natives in the region and decided to stop 70 miles early. This leads us to the third problem though. Even if he wasn't running away, he still wouldn't have successfully drawn a connecting line. It turned out that his math was wrong, and he was off by the 2.3 miles we see on the map today. But it's more than that. When you calculate the narrow strip of land that should have been New Mexico, it amounts to 603,348 acres. But due to laziness or a lack of scrutiny, the boundary was accepted and certified in 1891. In 1910, when New Mexico was ready to become a state, the error was discovered, and New Mexico made a push to reclaim the territory. However, within the strip of land that would then become part of New Mexico was the XIT Ranch, whose primary investor, a man named John Farwell, was also a friend of then-President William Howard Taft. Not wanting to lose any land rights, Farwell successfully persuaded President Taft to tell New Mexico to leave the border as it was, or forget becoming a state entirely. New Mexico, understandably, backed down, and the border remained as it is today. Speaking of boundaries, some are just as deliberate as they are bizarre. For example, have you ever noticed that the top of Delaware is round? This is because of something known as the 12-mile circle, a circular arc that makes up the boundary between Delaware and Pennsylvania, extending out from the Delaware town of Newcastle. Like many oddities of the eastern United States, the start of this line dates back to King Charles II, who in 1681 granted a deed to William Penn. The circle was the product of the monarch's exception to accommodate the needs of the Duke of York, who had won the area after a victory against Dutch colonists. The Duke later gave the lands to Penn a year after the agreement. The circle isn't without controversy, though. Of note is the fact that the circle claims that the entirety of the Delaware River is part of Delaware's territory. Normally, a water border is split evenly down the middle, but this claim over the entire waterway has sparked government disagreements between Delaware and New Jersey ever since. Although the Supreme Court attempted to put these concerns to rest, they continue to battle over the odd boundary, with Delaware even going as far as to request the National Guard for security in the early 2000s. This, however, was ultimately a symbolic gesture. For the time being, though, it's clear that Delaware's claim to the river will stand. Sticking with Delaware for a moment longer, this is a case where physical and man-made geography meet. We're talking about the Delaware Peninsula, or Delmarva Peninsula depending on who you ask. Delmarva is an East Coast peninsula portmanteau made up of parts of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. Although Delmarva is owned by 3 different governments who probably secretly wish to own it all themselves, it is a landmass that has since developed its own separate culture. In fact, many are quick to point out that Delmarva has a distinct accent and way of speaking. Additionally, there have been efforts by the people to secede, but these efforts have proven to be unsuccessful. If they ever managed to break away from the mainlanders, as they call them, the total population would be about 1.4 million, similar in size to Hawaii. This is one of those rare cases where separation does appear to make a bit of sense, considering that the people of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia appear to support their independence for a variety of reasons. Independence or not, Delmarva definitely deserves its place on this list. At number 15, take a look at this protruding piece of border on the northwest corner of Pennsylvania. In this area, we have what is known as the Erie Triangle, a 300-square-mile piece of land that was a fairly hot-button issue between 5 states as well as Native American tribes. Each argued their claim to the land, as it represented valuable access to the waters of Lake Erie. When Native American leaders heard of Pennsylvania's intent to access the land, they voiced their opposition, saying, "We must observe to you that we are sent in order to make peace, and that we are not authorized to stipulate any particular cession of lands." They also encouraged their people to actively oppose any attempts by American settlers to occupy the land. The opposition was not enough, however, and the U.S. government ultimately approved a sale of the land to Pennsylvania in 1792. The Native American tribes were paid $2,800 from Pennsylvania and $1,200 from the federal government. Unsurprisingly, this didn't placate the tribes' concerns, and conflict erupted in that region. But after the group's defeat by the United States Army in 1795, the tribes relented, and Pennsylvania's chimney was set in stone. Our next geographic oddity brings us to Bristol, a city split in half by the states of Virginia and Tennessee. In 1771, a trading post was constructed to serve travelers heading west for a better life. After about 1856, it reportedly prospered after the link between the Norfolk, Western, and Southern railways was finally joined. 2 communities were given city charters in 1890 with the name Bristol, triggering a pretty heated boundary dispute until 1901, when a line virtually halved the settlement along the center of State Street. Upon closer inspection, there are markers to indicate the separation, and the dispute, for the most part, ended amicably. Like Delmarva, both halves of Bristol share the same culture and quirks, with nothing separating them other than the invisible line separating all states in the Union. While some boundaries are fixed, other boundaries change by the season. Meet Maryland, a state well known for its extensive waterways, with a major historical seaport located in Baltimore. Due to its terraqueous nature, water rights take up a large portion of Maryland's legal disputes, especially when it comes to its boundary issues with Virginia. For decades, both states have entered numerous negotiations regarding control over the Potomac River, 400 miles long from its headwaters at North Branch to its mouth in the Chesapeake Bay. It ranks 48th among 135 U.S. rivers that are more than 100 miles long. The river is about 11 miles wide between Point Lookout and Smith Point. Ultimately, Maryland owns everything up to the low water mark on the Virginia side. What makes this especially strange is that rainfall essentially dictates how large Maryland is in a given year. If the season proves to be wet, the water level in the Potomac will rise, technically expanding the size of Maryland for the duration of that particular period. At number 18, we have another exclave. This time, it's the famous Kentucky Bend, a child of the Mississippi River, encircled by the states of Missouri and Tennessee. As of the 2020 census, the population was 9 persons in this area, tabulated as the Kentucky Bend Census County Division. The mailing address of the area is Tiptonville, Tennessee. New Madrid, Missouri is directly across the river to the north, but it isn't connected to the Bend by road or ferry. Covering an area of 26.9 square miles, this little patch of land was given to Kentucky due to general uncertainty regarding the Mississippi River. Unlike the Erie Triangle or the New Mexico-Oklahoma border, nobody is 100% sure why the Kentucky Bend was drawn out in this exact way. There have been cases where Tennessee locals have disputed the validity of the bend, but overall, most people, including the residents of this Oxbow Loop enclosed space, are confused about who rightfully owns it. In fact, Mark Twain references the Kentucky Bend in his book Life on the Mississippi, inspired by its peculiarity. As one can clearly see, many of these geographical oddities, however they initially came about, can be divisive for those living near or in them. In some cases, however, they can be a positive example of how people can make the best out of an inconvenient situation. For the most part, this seems to be the reality for the citizenry of Texarkana, a dual municipality astride the Texas-Arkansas boundary, United States. The city also lies near the Louisiana and Oklahoma state lines. First settled in 1874 at the junction of the Cairo and Fulton and the Texas and Pacific Railways, it derived its name from Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. With the rapid expansion of railways, markets were quick to collaborate with an expanding network, and the railroads were more than happy to oblige. The late 1850s saw builders working with the Cairo and Fulton Railroad enthusiastically pushing their lines south across Arkansas. Over the next half-century, rivalries formed between the builders, and eventually, the border was the logical juncture for growing railways. Today, Texas and Arkansas are divided by State Line Avenue, but they're still deeply connected economically and culturally. They even share a post office and courthouse. Next, we have ourselves an additional exclave called the Lost Peninsula. This small piece of Monroe County, in the southeasternmost corner of Michigan, spawned after the Toledo War boundary dispute in 1835 and 1836 to determine whether the state of Ohio or the Michigan Territory would control an area known as the Toledo Strip. Now, most people don't know this, but there have been cases when states, outside of the Civil War, of course, went to battle to resolve disputes. Funnily enough, this wasn't really one of those times. In fact, the Toledo War arguably shouldn't be called a war at all, considering there were no real casualties. On top of that, there was barely any damage to property, making it a bit of an ongoing joke among the people of the Midwest. After the virtually bloodless war had come to an end, the new state border was established at approximately the 41° 44' north latitude line, just north of the mouth of the Maumee River. Oddly enough, the line continued across the Ottawa River, rendering the peninsula disconnected from the rest of the state, giving it the name Lost Peninsula. From exclave to exclave, we find ourselves at the next geographical oddity, Point Roberts, Washington. This area, with a population of 1,191 according to the 2020 census, is as much a political oddity as it is a geographical one. According to available records, the western United States-Canadian border follows the 49th parallel because of the Oregon Treaty signed on the 15th of June, 1846. The treaty ended a dispute between Britain and the U.S. for claims to the area now known as the Rocky Mountains of Oregon Country. The little piece of the Point Roberts Peninsula was south of the 49th parallel, and thus was placed in the United States, but it's not connected by any land. It was a favored spot for Icelandic immigrants, and they still make up 1/7 of the land residents. At number 22, this is one of the most popular geographic oddities for most people in the United States, as well as a cross-country hotspot for many driving through the West: the Four Corners Monument. Depending on who you ask, this place is either a tourist trap or a site that exemplifies the historical complexities of the time period. At the start, the first boundary was drawn after the Compromise of 1850, a series of bills written to combat rising tensions leading up to the Civil War. It consequently created the New Mexico Territory and Utah Territory, followed by a transfer of land to the newly created Colorado Territory in 1861. When the Confederate States of America were gaining traction with the Arizona Territory, the Union responded by creating another of the same name. The Union definition split New Mexico along a north-south line, the 32nd meridian west from Washington, which simply extended the boundary between Colorado and Utah southward. The Union Plan eventually became reality, and this created the quadrupoint at the modern Four Corners. Today, there are slight differences in the New Mexico boundary, but the Four Corners remain standing as a monument to the rising tensions between the North and South, as well as a fun way to say that you were in four places at once, if you managed to make that famous detour. When we think about these oddities, it's often exclusively domestic issues. But sometimes developments take us to faraway places. In 1590, a Spanish missionary, Fray José de Acosta, came up with an interesting theory regarding a possible land bridge connecting Asia to North America, as cross-continental migration was a hotly debated issue at the time. Now, although a majority of this belief has since been dismissed, we do know that there is a period of time when Russia and the US were at least partially connected. It's called the Bering Strait, an ice bridge that is often said to close the 53-mile gap, at its narrowest point, between America and Siberia. It's inspired quite a few bizarre discussions between the two countries. In April of 2007, Russian government officials told the press that the Russian government would back a $65 billion plan by a consortium of companies to build a Bering Strait tunnel. But as you know, relations between the US and Russia are not exactly what we'd call amicable at this point, and thus the project has never come to fruition. Next up, we're taking a look at Michigan's Upper Peninsula, or as many Midwesterners call it, the UP, a 16,377 square mile landmass bordering 3 Great Lakes, as well as the north of Wisconsin. One quick look at this gem is enough to make anyone scratch their head, as it doesn't appear to make much sense why this territory doesn't belong to the Cheese Kings. Well, once again, we need only look at the silly conflict known as the Toledo War. This conflict between Michigan and Ohio was full of idle threats. In this case, the two sides' militias started trying to ruffle feathers. They shot at the air, which in today's day and age is known as duck hunting, prompting President Jackson to push the affair to a swift conclusion. In the end, Ohio ended up with the Toledo Strip to stop the state from its effort to prevent Michigan's statehood. In a rather strange trade, Michigan received the Upper Peninsula. At the start, it seemed like a bum deal, but the following decades proved otherwise, as Michigan was left with an abundance of natural resources. Our final oddity is a physical one that really needs no introduction, as it has been frequently referenced at different points of this wavy list. This would be none other than the Mississippi River. One of the world's major river systems in size, habitat diversity, and biological productivity, it is renowned for its cultural and commercial significance throughout the United States of America. From songs to movies to great works of literature, the Mississippi River is a natural beacon to all those blessed to be in its presence. Flowing 2,350 miles from Lake Itasca in Minnesota, the river powers a significant segment of the economy in the upper Midwest. Barges and their tows move approximately 175 million tons of freight each year on the upper Mississippi through a system of 29 locks and dams. It's also a major recreational resource for boaters, canoeists, hunters, anglers, and birdwatchers, and offers many outdoor opportunities. On top of that, it pumps through Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, of course, and Louisiana, and has been used to draw the borders between a majority of the territories connected to it. Quoting Mark Twain, "The Mississippi River will always have its own way. No engineering skill can persuade it to do otherwise." We hope you've enjoyed these 25 geographical oddities of the US. Their presence exemplifies the rich diversity to be found in this relatively young country, as well as, in some cases, how humanity finds a way to reach compromise with the most unique solutions. Are there any oddities you'd like to learn about more, or any that we missed in this list? Let us know in the comments below. Now check out some other videos, such as the real reason ships don't pass under South America, or why one of the USA's biggest lakes is reappearing centuries after disappearing. Thanks for watching. Texas is one of the industrial and economic powerhouses of the US. If it was allowed to secede from the country, it would certainly be able to thrive alone. However, that doesn't make it immune to population and societal issues, some of which are unique to the state while others plague the nation as a whole. Let's dig into why the Lone Star State might not be as perfect as you think. First off, it's undeniable that Texas is one of the fastest growing states in the country. The census data from 2010 onwards suggests that the population is growing at a rate of roughly 1.5% per year. In total, the population of Texas increased by more than 19% between 2010 and 2022, compared to the national average of only 7.7% across all states. In fact, between July 2022 and July of 2023, Texas accounted for 30% of the nation's total population growth. Out of the 1.6 million people the U.S. gained as a whole, just over 470,000 of them became Texas residents. The state celebrated crossing the 30 million population threshold in 2022. Of course, California remains the most populous state with roughly 39 million citizens at the time, but Texas's population is increasing at the cost of California's. So let's start with how Texas managed to grow. There are three main avenues for how the population can grow in the US. The first one is natural, the result of the difference between births and deaths in the state itself. On that front, Texas is doing relatively well. Even though there were fewer recorded births in the state during 2022 than the previous year, there were even fewer recorded deaths in the state as well, giving Texas an overall positive replacement rate. But natural population growth only accounts for between 25 and 30% of the new population each year. The other two avenues are much more vital and are due to immigration, international and intranational. The first is relatively obvious, counting new citizens that come from other countries. International migration in Texas accounts for roughly 40% of all migration, roughly 20% of the total population growth. Perhaps the most important reason behind Texas's explosive population growth is migration within the US, which is also why California is losing citizens. The single largest flow of people moving between states in 2022 happened between California to Texas, with almost 100,000 movers going from the former to the latter. Some of the most common reasons why US citizens want to move to Texas include the relative affordability of houses and utilities, lack of taxes, and a different political sphere. Compared to California, for example, Texas has roughly 20% lower utility costs, owing to the fact that Texas is a significant electricity, oil, and gas producer across the US, and the median house value in 2021 was nearly half that of California's. Of course, there's a matter of politics, considering California has been a blue state for a while Texas has remained largely red, despite much of the western United States turning blue for years. The last part is largely due to the fact that Texas is massive. It's by far the biggest state in the contiguous US, with significant swaths of both urban and rural areas, which is a nightmare we'll talk about later, and not nearly as lopsided an urban to rural population ratio as California. While Texas is still considered a majority-minority state, with overwhelming Republican support across the board. 180 out of the 254 counties in Texas have moved closer to the Republican side. While that's still in favor of the majority, it tells us that a significant number of counties are still leaning left. So why is this important? Well, while we mentioned the overwhelming population growth in Texas, it also bears elaborating that this growth skews away from small regions. Counties that belong to the state's major population centers of Houston, Dallas-Fort Worth, Austin, and San Antonio typically see the highest growth rates. On the other hand, over 90 counties, mostly in the South and the West, have actually lost population over the last few years. This can create a situation where some areas will see a significant shift in the discrepancy between local and national politics and how it shapes representation. Additionally, the rapidly rising urban population has led to the cost of living skyrocketing in the cities. According to the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts, the average house price in Texas rose by over 40% between 2019 and 2023. But the cities have it much worse, with the Houston area seeing price increases of 128% over that same period. That means that the price of an average home in Houston has more than doubled within just 4 years. By contrast, incomes that qualified for a mortgage of an average home rose by only 45% in the area. The main causes? The aforementioned population increases, housing shortages, and different work policies. The COVID-19 pandemic caused a significant shift towards work-from-home policies. In 2020 and 2021, it was one of the main reasons why so many Californians moved to Texas, with cheaper house prices being the major contributor. Overall, roughly 16% of Texans Texans worked from home as of 2021, compared to only 6% before the pandemic started. This has allowed many more suburban areas to thrive, typically at the expense of the already congested cities. With the rise of online work, you'd think that more Texans would be in favor of leaving the congested cities and moving to more rural areas. However, that doesn't seem to be the case. The current major population centers in Texas are all supported by an extensive infrastructure network and have extremely developed industries, both in the tech and energy sectors, perhaps two of the most significant drivers behind Texas becoming an economic powerhouse of the US. As a result, the rest of the state is relatively disconnected from the center. One of the examples where infrastructure matters is that Texas is one of the states that sees significant impact from hurricanes. Hurricane Beryl caused 36 deaths and significant property damage, but even regular storms can leave Texas wanting for basic utilities. Case in point, Texas experienced 210 instances of major electrical outages, affecting more than 50,000 people between 2020 and 2023. By contrast, the next highest on that dubious list is California with 145, and that state has its own share of problems. In addition, Beryl hit Houston, one of the state's largest cities, which is already well positioned to handle infrastructure issues. The more rural areas don't really stand a chance. But not all infrastructure is made equal. The Texan government allocates the state's budget differently depending on whether communities or counties are predominantly urban or rural. In the 2020 census, the US government slightly changed the requirements for whether a municipality is considered urban or rural, resulting in some 4.2 million people across the country becoming rural citizens without moving. According to these new guidelines, Texas remains the state with the largest number of citizens living in rural areas, at roughly 7 million. Ultimately, this creates a tricky situation for the state government. A state like California, with more than 90% urban population, can easily allocate significant resources for urban planning, particularly infrastructure and city services. On the other hand, Texas has a rural population closer to Maryland, which is 27 times smaller in land area while containing about a fifth of Texas's population. Just let those two numbers sink in a bit. The Texan government needs to connect counties that are much farther apart to service all of its citizens, and the cities still represent a significant population portion of the state to make that possible. Still, ignoring the problems of rural communities leaves 7 million citizens left out in the cold. To put this into perspective, a state with 7 million people, Massachusetts, is the 15th most populous state in the US. But despite these issues, one of Texas's biggest problems is housing and how it's regulated. According to 2019 estimates, Texas was 330,000 housing units short of what would be ideal for the state's population numbers, with only California going through a bigger housing crisis. The 2024 estimate isn't much better, at 306,000 units short. The government has two issues that it needs to tackle to remedy this. The first problem is the rising housing costs. As mentioned, some cities have experienced unparalleled housing cost increases over the last few years, and the trend doesn't seem to be slowing down. But perhaps the bigger issue is one related to Texas zoning laws and minimal plot sizes for homes. In a city, this directly contributes to rising housing costs, since investors will ultimately make a house on a larger plot to retain that traditional setting of a home with a large yard, which means a higher cost. Apart from increasing the cost of the house, plot sizes have also been linked to racial segregation by the way of making them unattainable for low-income families of color. Plot sizes also directly impact city infrastructure. Larger homes mean that a municipality can have only so many of them in an area, which limits population density for higher-cost housing. Additionally, the city architecture itself begins sprawling outwards, creating larger, less walkable cities that only increase the need for cars or complicated public transport and lead to a rise in carbon emissions. Some cities have started working on the issue. Houston, for example, has a minimal lot size of only 1,400 square feet. This can permit tens of thousands of new housing units to be built inside the city or the creation of more urban areas that directly connect to it. The state as a whole has arguably not made much headway in this regard. While the Houston change is a boon, it happened way back in 2013. Other parts of the state have yet to follow through, usually due to the aforementioned issue of lack of bipartisan support across counties. However, a bigger issue is perhaps that the state government simply hasn't spent enough on public housing. Texas has come 49th in the US in housing expenditure as a share of its overall budget, ranking only slightly above Nebraska, a state with only 2 million people. This neatly outlines the biggest issue with Texas's people problem. Unlike many other states, the people of Texas live too far apart and in conditions too varied. The red-blue political divide across counties makes implementing statewide laws difficult, and the previous notion of Texas being affordable has all but disappeared. Even if the government creates a solution, the sheer size and scale of the problem will take years to get implemented. By that time, Texas might no longer be the second most populous state, but instead the first, and it will bear significantly more pressure. But what do you think? Leave your thoughts and ideas in the comments section below, and as always, thank you for watching. With war engulfing the globe, the odds of the US having to enter an international conflict once again is something that might keep you up at night. But what if we told you that one of the greatest threats to the United States comes from inside the country? That threat is a 2,350-mile stretch of water that runs through 10 American states and is one of the most important natural resources of the US, the Mississippi River. How could this vital river be a ticking time bomb rather than a blessing? We answer that question in this video as we explain why the Mississippi is America's Achilles heel. America and its economy relies on the Mississippi. It's one of the waterborne arterial highways of the US, with the upper Mississippi alone seeing around 175 million tons of freight navigating its waters annually. And that's not all. In 2019, the whole river carried a staggering 500 million short tons of exports, imports, and domestic freight per year, making it a key part of the trade connection that the US has with the rest of the world. It's also important to note that trade is not the most important thing the Mississippi offers. It's also invaluable to American livelihood. For over 2 centuries, the Mississippi Basin has been a hotbed of agricultural activity, with the businesses that operate in the basin being responsible for 92% of America's agricultural exports. While that's important from a trade perspective, domestically, that basin accounts for over half of all of America's agricultural land, with the river also feeding into a network of 250 other rivers. Simply put, those waters are vital to keeping America running. But as you'll discover in a moment, those same waters could also spell the country's demise. Climate change has already done a real number on the Mississippi River, and it threatens to make the waterway even more dangerous in the future. Since 1958, climate change has led to a 27% increase in precipitation in the southeastern United States, with much of that extra rain flowing directly into the Mississippi. There's a clear trend toward heavier rainstorms affecting the river, according to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, and the floods that result from this climate change threaten to leave Mississippi cities like Vicksburg and Natchez vulnerable to greater inland flooding in the future. We already saw the impact of this in May of 2011. During that month, NASA recorded the river rising to just over 54 feet, less than 2 feet shy of the all-time record of around 56 feet recorded in May of 1927. In that 1927 flood, the river reached a width of almost 80 miles in some areas of Vicksburg. A levee failed, allowing the river's floodwaters to reach towns almost 60 miles away from the riverbed. Thousands of homes and businesses were destroyed, with crops being waterlogged in the process. The 2011 flood surpassed the 1927 flood in terms of its crest, with the waters eventually rising to around a staggering 57 feet. Those types of problems are only going to be exacerbated as the climate continues to warm. And frankly, the US is going to suffer as a result. In May of 2019, the Mississippi flooded again, with Scientific American placing the cost of the damage at $12.5 billion, roughly equivalent to $1 billion in damage for each of the 12 major cities the floods affected. And that is far from the only Mississippi flood to cause massive economic damage. A similar flood in 1993 cost the nation $21 billion. And the floods are getting more frequent. Between 2014 and 2019, the river flooded 4 times, each with the potential to cause billions of dollars in damage. As that frequency increases, we can expect the flooding of the Mississippi to become an annual event that destroys crops, hurts businesses, and forces untold numbers of repairs in American cities. And that's not even the worst of it. Droughts are just as much of a problem for the Mississippi. Water levels in the lower part of the river have been dropping since July of 2024, 8 feet below their historic average. Combine these floods and droughts, and you get a lethal combo with the potential to destroy crops, shatter businesses, wreck the U.S. economy, and, at their worst, kill thousands of people. The Mississippi flood of 1927 killed between 250 and 1,000 people alone, while displacing 700,000 more. But it gets worse. The Mississippi River is governed by a series of locks and dam structures. There are 29 of these structures in the upper Mississippi alone, with the locks and dams creating a stairway of water that allows barges and pleasure boats to safely sail through the river's waters. These dams are really starting to age. Most were built between 1930 and 1940, with engineers at the time believing their lifespans would be about 50 years. We're now close to a century away from those original construction dates, and the dams are still operating thanks to the Army Corps of Engineers making routine repairs every year. The question is, how much longer can they hold out? Many of these dams still have original parts that are more than 90 years old. What happens if one of those dams breaks? Well, the Upper Mississippi Lock 25 project, which was supposed to add a new lock and dam to the river, was supposed to be fully funded. The last estimate in 2018 was around $730 million, though it looks like the project will need at least an extra $332 million for completion. That's just over $1 billion for a single lock and dam. Now, imagine what happens if the 90-plus-year-old locks and dams currently holding the Mississippi waters all go down. That's a very strong possibility, given their age and the decades of funding neglect that has gone on. But replacing all 29 locks and dams would add up to over $30 billion, and that's assuming the Lock 25 project doesn't require more money. This financial black hole is compounded by what happens when a dam breaks: catastrophic flooding, as the water is suddenly released all at once. Any population center downstream of the river would be at risk of devastating property and environmental damage, along with loss of life. Just how bad the effects would be are unknown, as none of the Mississippi's dams has broken yet. This torrent of floodwaters would also accelerate the eroding of the Mississippi's banks. Research conducted in the 1990s found that the wakes produced by high-powered motorboats accelerated the natural erosion of the river's banks at a rate of between 2 and 14 feet per year. Imagine what the rushing water flowing down from a shattered dam could do. Most of the 130 bridges that cross the Mississippi River would be at risk, either being consumed by the floodwaters and collapsing, or being damaged structurally to the point where they require costly repairs. The 500 million tons of trade that flows through the river each year would slow to a crawl. Around 60% of America's grain simply would not get to where it needs to go, creating the risk of famine. How could it possibly get worse for the Mississippi? Well, we can throw ice into the equation to create yet another risk both to the American economy and the lives of sailors who have to brave the river. In January of 2020, an ice jam in the Mississippi caused localized flooding in Anoka and Champlin in Minnesota. This is a rare occurrence for the river. Its sheer width makes ice jams less frequent than in rivers that are narrower, shallower, and have more bends. Still, this single jam led to water at the Anoka City Dam elevating and led to flooding of the Ferry Street Bridge, as well as a pedestrian path. But if the Mississippi isn't as prone to these jams, why would they represent such a massive problem? The answer is that it's not necessarily jams that are going to cause big problems for the Mississippi. It's climate change melting more of the river's ice cover. Studies suggest that the Mississippi will lose most of its ice cover if climate change continues at the same rate it is today. And we're already seeing the effects of this issue. Ice is disappearing from the southern portions of the river, or it's icing off earlier than it used to. As the ice melts earlier and faster than it should, it can contribute to jams. In March of 2024, Wisconsin experienced the warmest winter it has on record, almost 10 degrees warmer than the 3-month winter average of 18.5 degrees for the region. The result was a January deep freeze of the part of the Mississippi that flows through the state, followed by a rapid warm-up that forced the ice to quickly float downstream. Float is the key word here. Conservation staff in Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri all reported seeing stretches of pancake ice and ice flows, which are both rare in those sections of the river. That has the potential to wreak havoc on shipping schedules, and portions of the river that don't usually have to deal with ice may face raised water levels. So what really makes the Mississippi River the Achilles heel of the United States? The simple answer is that so much trade flows through the river, any changes to it threaten serious economic and social impact. Flooding has become more common. The 2019 flood caused $12.5 billion in damages alone, in addition to creating high currents and the closure of locks. These both affected commercial shipping. Add droughts in some parts of the river and the terrible state of its locks and dams, and you have a powder keg waiting to explode. Then, add a healthy dose of climate change into the mix. Ice jams will become more common due to ice melting faster and earlier than it should. It all adds up to a river that has the potential to cost the US billions of dollars in the coming years. But what do you think? Are we maybe taking this a little too seriously? Or are there some things we may have missed along the way? Let us know your thoughts and comments below, and as always, thanks for watching and take care out there. The sky darkens. Thick ash blankets everything like a snowdrift, and something in your gut tells you to seek shelter. The president gives an emergency press conference preaching the duty to remain calm and maintain your resolve, saying that in times like these, Americans must hang tough and show their quality. The speech is suddenly cut off, and the power goes out. You make a mad dash for the grocery store, hoping that there is anything left that might sustain your family through the tragedy unfolding before your eyes. As people fight over canned goods, ammunition, and toilet paper, the reality of the present situation sinks in. The unthinkable has happened, and the Yellowstone volcano has finally erupted. The eruption showers the western United States with a scourge of hellfire and destruction unseen for thousands of years. Dark days of chaos and violence lie ahead. How could this have happened? Could anything have been done to avoid this? Let's dive in. So, when we say the Yellowstone volcano, what do we mean exactly? The Yellowstone volcano lives, as you might have guessed, under the Yellowstone National Park in the western United States. The park itself is massive, covering over 5,500 square miles or 9,000 square kilometers and encompassing parts of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. The park is an extremely popular tourist destination, offering visitors a variety of recreational and wildlife opportunities. The natural beauty of the place is really hard to put into words, looking as it did for thousands of years, not yet touched by the hand of mankind. All the while, most people are blissfully unaware that right beneath their feet is a force powerful enough to kill everything for miles and miles around. Might not want to include that in the tourist brochures. The volcano itself is about 30 by 45 miles wide, or 50 by 75 kilometers, more or less, and is designated as a supervolcano, which means that it has had an eruption with a volcanic explosivity index of 8, the highest number possible. For reference, the Mount St. Helens eruption that occurred on May 18th of 1980 was rated a 5 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. It has been called the most disastrous volcanic eruption in US history, and it still holds that title. In the aftermath of the eruption, thousands of animals were killed, hundreds of square miles were reduced to a wasteland, and about 60 people were killed, with over $3 billion in property damage. If you look at some of the pictures of the area surrounding the volcano right after the eruption, it looks like something you'd find in Mordor, not the Pacific Northwest. The Yellowstone volcano would be much worse and far more destructive. When a volcano erupts, it begins with a plume of heat rising up from the Earth's mantle. Burning its way through the crust, it would eventually form a pocket of magma, gases, water vapor, and more. As the pocket and the pressure inside it grow over many years, the ground at surface level starts to rise. The extreme volatility of molten rocks and gases would eventually cause the pocket to violently explode upwards, resulting in what is known as an eruption. Eruptions that are this violent and explosive can actually create their own wind field and are capable of pushing volcanic ash more than 600 miles or 965 kilometers against the pre-existing wind field. So, with that happy thought in mind, has it erupted before? The short answer is yes, but it was an extremely long time ago. There have been 3 major eruptions that we know of, those being 2.1 million years ago, 1.3 million years ago, and 640,000 years ago. These eruptions are known as caldera-forming eruptions and are large enough to form the iconic bowl shape of the volcano itself. Caldera is the Spanish word for cauldron. These are immensely powerful and change everything around the volcano indefinitely. The eruption that was over 2.1 million years ago allegedly produced over 2,500 times the amount of ash that was produced when Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980. Think about that for a second. There have been some smaller incidents in more recent years, but the major eruptions predated recorded history. So for as long as humans have been around, we have not actually witnessed a supervolcano eruption, and fingers crossed, we never will. Scientists from all over the world have worked tirelessly to try and uncover the secrets of this boiling cauldron. And while no one can say with absolute certainty what will happen the next time it explodes, they have an estimation of its explosive possibilities. We'll get to those estimations in a moment, but I'm sure the question at the forefront of your mind is, when is it going to explode again? Scientists from the University of Utah and the National Park Service went on record claiming they, quote, see no evidence that another such cataclysmic eruption will occur at Yellowstone in the foreseeable future. Recurrence intervals of these events are neither regular nor predictable. Well, the good news is that they don't think it will occur anytime soon if it ever does, with the best estimates putting it at another 100,000 years away. And these are drawn from taking an average of the time between previous eruptions. So, all in all, no one actually knows when this thing might erupt again, or if that's even a possibility. Many scientists, and specifically those at NASA, are keeping a close eye on this situation. In 2017, NASA scientists came up with a plan on how to prevent a supervolcano eruption. This plan included drilling down into the magma chamber approximately 6 miles or 10 kilometers below the surface and spraying high-pressure water streams into the chamber. The water would circulate through the chamber and result in a cooling of the magma and the release of heat at the surface level. If it works, it could become the blueprint for supervolcanoes all across the globe. As it currently stands, the plan has not been put into action yet. Probably because it would cost over $3.4 billion, and some scientists, such as Brian Wilcox of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, believe that the plan might do more harm than good. Wilcox believes that drilling into the chamber could release volatile gases, disrupt the natural order of the magma, and ultimately cause an eruption. So while the chances of this cataclysmic event unfolding are relatively low at present, at least someone out there has a plan if things take a turn for the worst. But if the worst were to happen, and the supervolcano sitting beneath Yellowstone erupted, what would happen? How would it impact the people, the wildlife, and the environment? To get the full picture of this, we have to look at the impact on everything in close proximity to the volcano as well as the rest of the world. In the immediate aftermath of the eruption, it's estimated that close to 100,000 people could be killed right away. The lives lost in the explosion, both human and animal, would be devastating. Whole communities could vanish in the blink of an eye or be reduced to a skeleton of their former selves. It's estimated that anywhere up to 40 miles or 65 kilometers from the park could be buried in lava, ash, and other debris. Again, humans have never witnessed a supervolcano explosion, so the best we can do is estimate the destructive force that would be unleashed, but all signs point to it being a cataclysm of biblical proportions. As untold amounts of death and destruction are rained down on the western United States, the rest of the country would not fare much better. While what we are about to discuss is likely a worst-case scenario, it is worth examining. As all life around the volcano is rendered extinct, the real destruction would come from the massive cloud of ash that would begin to spread. Volcanic ash is not like the ash from your fireplace. It's not soft and light at all, but very abrasive and heavy. It's composed of rocks, minerals, and volcanic glass, which is the last thing you want to breathe in or get into your eyes. Anyone who has been camping knows how unenjoyable accidentally inhaling wood smoke is, so it's hard to imagine how awful inhaling tiny shards of rock and volcanic glass must be. If you thought COVID was detrimental to the respiratory health of the country, breathing in this stuff would make COVID look like child's play. The floating wall of ash would spread quickly across all of North America, riding the winds created by the massive explosion. Seeing it approach would be like watching some sci-fi harbinger of doom or apocalyptic monster attack your town. Some scientists have theorized that the ash clouds could reach as far as Toronto, Dallas, or even further, raining down debris everywhere. Montana, Idaho, Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah would be absolutely buried under up to a meter of scalding hot volcano ash and debris. Boise, Denver, and Salt Lake City could face utter destruction as the clouds of ash swept across the landscape. Volcanic ash is very thick when piled up, and the cumulative weight of it could be enough to potentially cave in residential roofs or wreak havoc on critical pieces of infrastructure such as railways, highways, utilities, and the power grid. These cities and others close by could face over 3 feet of ashfall. Roads would be unusable as the ash would pile up, causing widespread accidents and a maze of abandoned vehicles. First responders would have great difficulty responding to any calls. If the ash does in fact destroy power transformers and down the power grid, the US would be immediately sent back to the 1800s. I'm sure everyone will remain perfectly calm and not react out of pure emotion when, the lights go out. The ash would turn rivers, streams, lakes, reservoirs, or any standing body of water into a toxic cesspool, unfit to support any life. All fish, reptiles, birds, or anything whose habitat includes a water source would be poisoned or die from other complications of having its habitat destroyed. Farmland and its precious fertile soil would become a toxic waste dump overnight. All the corn, soybeans, and other crops produced in the Midwest could become toxic immediately. This would not only destroy the livelihood of farmers themselves, but it would also majorly disrupt the United States' ability to grow food there for about a generation. A large portion of North America would become uninhabitable, while other major migrations would certainly cause mass chaos and violence. People would most likely take the law into their own hands and dispense their own form of frontier justice as the federal and state governments scrambled to keep up. The economic effects of such an eruption would be disastrous for the United States and the world in general. FEMA actually released a report where they estimated the amount of damage an eruption at Yellowstone could cause. They used data from 2021 and concluded that the damage would cost around $3 trillion, which is about 14% of the US GDP. How could anyone work with this going on? A massive volcanic eruption and your house collapsing from ashfall makes those Zoom calls seem a little less important. In addition to this, the ash clouds would be incredibly thick, so any planes, helicopters, or even cars caught outside would have no way to navigate, resulting in more destruction and death. Air travel across North America would be suspended indefinitely. The roving clouds of ash would essentially block out the sun, causing a drop in temperature across the continent. This lack of sunshine and already toxic farmland would have a disastrous effect on humans, animals, and plant life alike. Food supplies would dwindle quickly, and feeding the continually growing population of the United States, which is currently around 340 million, would be such a logistical nightmare that it is hard to even fathom. Food and water would have to be shipped into the United States continually, with no clear indication of when things would return to normal. The strain this would put on the global supply chain is incalculable, but would no doubt be disastrous. So, as we discussed, the clouds of ash would block out the sun for the United States. But what about the rest of the world? When volcanoes erupt, they can emit something called sulfur aerosols. These particles can reflect sunlight and lower temperatures. So, a roving ash cloud menace would contribute to a drop in global temperatures as well. Recent history provides some examples of what could happen when global temperature drops, even slightly. In 1991, in the Philippines, the eruption at Pinatubo dropped global temperatures by 1 degree for a few years. It killed over 800 people and caused around $200 million worth of property damage. In 1815, the eruption in Indonesia at Tambora dropped global temperatures, damaged crops around the world, and even has been linked to several devastating famines. Going back even further, we see Lake Toba in Indonesia. One of the world's largest calderas was formed by a massive eruption some 74,000 years ago. Obviously, we don't have concrete facts or primary sources of what happened, but the best estimates say that the eruption and ensuing ash cloud caused a volcanic winter so enduring that it lasted for 6 years and actually plunged the Earth into a 1,000-year-long ice age. Ice ages don't bode well for agriculture, so a large majority of the human population on Earth at the time perished. Many experts believe that at one point the overall population numbered only around 10,000 people. If Yellowstone was to erupt with all its terrifying force, scientists predict that global temperatures could drop by as much as 10 degrees for a full decade. The effects of this would not be immediate and might take a few years to fully roll out, but once they did, it would be an unmitigated disaster. Hundreds of millions would face food insecurity, famine, drought, resource wars, civil unrest, and more as the citizens of Earth grappled with their horrifying new reality. The amount of suffering caused by the ripple effects of this crisis would redefine not just humanity, but the world in general. Animals, marine, and plant life would all suffer as well, as their habitats would be destroyed or forever changed. Many species would become outright extinct or seriously endangered. These would be horrible times to live through for all. It's well known that natural disasters and emergencies cause people to set aside their differences and work together. But would that be the case here? How would the US respond to a natural disaster of such a magnitude? Well, the good news in this whole thing is that it won't just happen suddenly and catch us completely by surprise. An eruption of this scale would take some time to build up before it explodes. There will be plenty of warning signs and a team of people monitoring this around the clock. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory is, quote, a consortium of 9 state and federal agencies who provide timely monitoring and hazard assessment of volcanic, hydrothermal, and earthquake activity in the Yellowstone Plateau region. The men and women who work at the YVO work tirelessly to monitor, test, and report on any geological activity around Yellowstone. If an eruption was about to happen, they would be able to report it up the chain, and believe me, the government would be well aware of what was going on in the park. The YVO can be an advisor in times of geological crisis for the National Incident Management System of the federal government. If the government, NASA, the YVO, or whoever cannot delay or stop the eruption, which it's up for debate whether they even could, then FEMA and other supporting organizations would be brought in and attempted evacuations would begin. How much information the government releases to the public is up to them, though. They would not want to incite mass panic and chaos. People would be stubborn, not wanting to leave their homes without a very good reason. So it would go about as smoothly as you would expect. Remember Hurricane Katrina? All in all, if an imminent eruption could not be prevented, there is not much more the government and FEMA could do other than damage control and cleanup operations. Refugee and medical assistance camps would be set up across the affected areas. Once the immediate shock of what had happened subsided, people would work together, but would it be widespread enough to make a difference? It's hard to gauge. Long story short, if the Yellowstone volcano ever erupted with all of its might, the death toll would be staggering and the world would forever be altered. But for all the doom and gloom, there is some good news. The Yellowstone volcano will most likely not erupt for a long, long time. All reports by the YVO and other groups claim that the volcano is pretty calm with nothing major going on. So don't go raid the grocery store or dig a bunker in your backyard, because we aren't there yet. Thanks for watching. If you're more interested in videos like these, you can check out some of our other videos like What's the Safest Place on Earth? Or maybe you're interested in the real reason people disappear in the Bermuda Triangle. See you in the next one. Many borders around the world are bizarre, and today we'll take a closer look at some of the world's most unusual and distinctive borders. Borders hold a lot of significance geographically, politically, historically, and culturally. They separate countries and can hold real significance for our world. Sometimes marked by flags, checkpoints, guards, or violence, borders can look different depending on the place. Whether formed through conflict or cooperation, whether agreed upon or disputed, borders can tell a story of the people, our planet, and the histories of where nations meet. In some places, national borders can take on a life of their own, representing a unique convergence of countries or topographical features. So, what's the deal with borders? Are they meant to divide, or are they arbitrary? What caused us to draw these divisions as they are? While there are many famous borders known for conflict and violence, such as between North and South Korea, Israel and Palestine, and Russia and Ukraine, there are many others that are more peaceful, such as the border between the United States and Canada, which is considered the longest undefended border in the world. There are many national borders marked by stunning geographic features, man-made architecture, and more. Let's explore together some of the world's most fascinating borders. Violence and conflict between countries is not uncommon at national borders. Even so, the appearance, history, and cultural contexts of some borders can be especially unique and distinct. This is especially true of the Middle East, where many territories and borders are heavily disputed. The border between Afghanistan and Pakistan is especially distinctive. The Torkham Gate lies between the two states, which is a key border crossing and visually stunning piece of infrastructure that divides the states. The gate itself is one of the busiest border crossings between the two states. However, the Torkham Gate is especially known for its violence and danger. The crossing at Torkham is manned on the Afghan side by armed Taliban soldiers, and there are often tight controls imposed on the pedestrians crossing there. Crowds are sometimes pushed back from the border by Taliban soldiers. However, the recent departure of President Ashraf Ghani means Afghan forces deteriorated, which necessitated Pakistani authorities' cooperation with the Taliban to ensure borders remain adequately staffed and orderly. Nonetheless, over the past few years, both sides of the border have accused the others of sheltering militant groups and allowing attacks from across the border. Pakistan built a long metal fence through the snow-peaked mountains and dangerous ravines along its 1,600-mile-long frontier, and has equipped the border with cameras, watchtowers, more than 800 drones, and over 440 forts in the northwestern region alone. This example of a heavily guarded border is indicative of deeper political disputes and intertwined histories that separate the two nation-states. But a fortified border, while interesting, isn't particularly bizarre, and we'll see that later on in our list. But first, let's head to Africa. The continent of Africa is home to many unique borders between countries. There are 54 recognized countries in Africa, with an additional 2 states that are disputed. One unique border is between Spain and Morocco, where the European country and African country are divided by high fences meant to discourage illegal immigration between countries. This border demonstrates how the criminalization of immigration of undocumented people can be advanced by the design of borders. Spain occupies several small pieces of land adjacent to Morocco, which it acquired during the Spanish War with Muslim forces during the 15th and 16th centuries. Originally, Spain strategically took hold of these areas for the purpose of monitoring these forces. These are small sovereign territories, including the rock fort of Peñón de Vélez de la Gomera. Peñón de Vélez de la Gomera was a small, naturally rocky island until the 1930s, when a storm dropped large quantities of sand between the island and the mainland, which created a tombolo, or a tide island. This peninsula marks the world's shortest land border in the world, at only 85 meters long. Currently, Moroccan authorities have demanded the territory be returned to Morocco. Another notable border is that between Lesotho and South Africa, since Lesotho is completely landlocked by South Africa. There are 11 functional road borders between the two states. Lesotho is a natural paradise with beautiful waterfalls, rich culture, tall mountain peaks, and breathtaking vistas. We've talked about many borders that are hotly contested and disputed, but what about borders that are a no man's land in a sense? Lands that nations actively shun. This is the case for part of the border between Egypt and Sudan. A roadless patch of desert called Bir Tawil, located between the two countries, is uninhabited and unwanted because both countries prefer their own historic boundary lines. Because their claims to land would be weakened by accepting Bir Tawil as their own, neither Egypt nor Sudan will claim said land, even though Bir Tawil is habitable. Many have sought to claim the land, whether organizations or individuals, but none have had much international success. Unlike Bir Tawil, however, Asia is full of breathtaking landmarks that have been used to divide countries, as we'll soon see. In Asia, like in many parts of the world, there are many unique national borders. Sometimes even geological features are used to divide nations. One example that stands out in particular is the border between China and Nepal. Mount Everest stands 29,000 feet tall between China and Nepal, separating the two countries. Another is the border between China and Vietnam, where waterfalls mark the divide. The Ban Duc de Tian Falls separate the two countries, indicating yet another geological marker of national boundaries. Similarly, a very popular hiking path called Sandakphu Trail travels the border between India and Nepal. Another geological border is located where Laos, Myanmar, and Thailand meet, which is called the Golden Triangle. The Golden Triangle is where the Rak and Mekong rivers meet. On the Thai side of the Golden Triangle, a giant golden Buddha statue marks this convergence of 3 rivers and the 3 countries. Just wait until we head over to Europe, where things start to get really interesting. Europe is home to 44 sovereign states. What you might not know, however, is that within the continent there are many bizarre, beautiful, and curious borders that attract attention worldwide. Between the walls of the Vatican, a labyrinth uniting 3 European countries, a cairn where 3 time zones meet, and more, there are plenty of bizarre borders for us to explore. So where in Europe has the most unusual borders? Let's take a look. One of the most famous borders in Europe is that of the Vatican City, which is encompassed by a stunning walled border. Vatican City is an independent city-state that's landlocked within the urban area of Rome, Italy. The Vatican is the world's smallest independent state, with an area of 49 hectares and the world's shortest boundary at just 2 miles or 3.2 kilometers. Yeah, you heard that right. It's that small. The Vatican is an example of what is known as an enclave, a territory that is completely surrounded by the territory of another state, which in this case would be Italy. The Vatican City was created as an independent state by the Lateran Treaty in 1929, which took place between the Holy See and the Kingdom of Italy. Buildings were meant to create the boundary between the Vatican and Rome, and a small part of the frontier of the modern wall was built to supplement this boundary. The territory of the Vatican includes St. Peter's Square, which is distinguished from Italian territory through a white line along the limit of the square. The Vatican isn't the only country landlocked by Italy, however. San Marino is a completely independent microstate of just 23 square miles or 61 square kilometers, making it the 5th smallest country in the world. Surrounded entirely by Italy, the border is between the two regions of Emilia-Romagna and Marche. Another famous border converges at Europe's largest outdoor shrub maze, where the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany meet. The Drielandenpunt Labyrinth was designed by a British landscaper named Adrian Fisher, who used 17,000 hornbeam cuttings to create the maze. The maze is located in the most southeastern and highest part of the Netherlands, and it is said to take up to an hour to complete. Visitors can climb a platform at the center where they'll be able to see all 3 countries in the distance. At the entrance of the maze is a roof in the shape of a giant butterfly, which makes this border even more unique. Beyond this, there's a big water playground near the maze that was created by dozens of fountains, as well as numerous other recreational activities for labyrinth visitors to explore, such as a playground, clay shooting, and archery. There are also smuggling games, where visitors can reenact the passage of smugglers looking to save money crossing borders, and a restaurant called the Borderstone Tavern. Clearly, this border of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany is a unique place to visit, but it's only one of many bizarre and fascinating borders in Europe and worldwide. Where else are there other intriguing borders like the Drielandenpunt Labyrinth? Let's find out. The Treriksrøyse is another great example of a unique border between countries. Where Norway's northern end reaches both Finland and Russia is another 3-country border with a cairn marking their convergence. The fact that the 3 countries all meet at this border is not the only unique aspect of this border, however. At this nexus of Finland, Norway, and Russia, you can leap forward or backward 2 hours, depending on which border you cross. Usually, at a time zone border, you would only go ahead or behind by 1 hour at a time. However, Norway's hook-like shape causes it to meet both Finland and Russia, which causes the Central European Time, Eastern European Time, and further Eastern European time zones to all meet. When Norway follows Central European Standard Time, this means that Norway is at GMT, or Greenwich Mean Time, the standard used to reconcile all time zones, +1. At the same point in the year, Finland finds itself at GMT +2, while the part of Russia bordering these countries is GMT +3. Between the countries of Poland and Ukraine, there famously was cross-border land art created by the artist Jaroslav Koczara in 2011 that was designed to symbolically erase the divisions between the two countries. This land art was made on a stretch of farmland shared by Haradysche, Poland, and Varech, Ukraine. The landscape-based art between the countries include images of a giant fish called a crop circle fish, plowed in turf, which was meant to show the unity between the countries. Koczara created the temporary fish through planting seeds in a fish-shaped design. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, there have been more than 7.7 million people who have fled Ukraine following Russia's invasion of the country, and many Ukrainians have sought refuge in neighboring countries like Poland. Over 4 million have migrated to Poland, and even more have moved to Romania, Russia, Hungary, Moldova, Slovakia, and Belarus. The border between Norway and Sweden is emphasized as a place with cross-border mobility and flourishing trade, with more than 25,000 people commuting over the border to get to work each day. Norway and Sweden's border is said to be efficient and smooth running, which is surprising given the common disputes and heavy guarding between borders. The countries have large cultural similarities, an ability to understand each other's languages, and share an intertwined history, having been united from 1814 to 1905. There is much cooperation between Norway and Sweden, which are part of a passport union started in the 1950s to provide ID-free travel between them and the other Nordic states, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland. Between Norway and Sweden, there has been a thin strip of trees removed to mark the national border. Given the snow that accumulates there, snowmobilers often use the path regularly. The border between Italy and Switzerland also connects to winter sports. The Matterhorn, one of the largest peaks in the Alps, makes up part of the border between the two countries. As a result of climate change and glacial melting, the border has been shifting. Even so, skiers enjoy recreation at the border and on Matterhorn. One of the most elaborate border crossings in Europe is that of Belgium and the Netherlands, which zigzags through Baarle-Nassau, a Dutch town that shares a border between the countries, with its Belgian sister city Baarle-Hertog on the other side. There are over 24 separate pieces of land belonging to Belgium embedded into the Netherlands, kind of like a patchwork quilt, as a result of medieval treaties and exchanges of land from over the years. Each side of the city had between as many as 10 or 20 enclaves of the other country, creating many isolated sections located in Belgium within the Netherlands and vice versa. To keep things running smoothly, the countries decided to define their border by installing white crosses in the pavement across town. These markers are very precise, running through shops, stores, lawns, and a cafe. At one point in time, there was a Dutch law requiring restaurants to close early, but rather than kicking out patrons, servers would move their guests to tables on the Belgian side of the cafe. Elections can also be a challenge, as houses are split by the border as well, so towns determine who lives in which country by where their front door is based. A similar boundary runs between France and Switzerland. In a small village on the border called La Cure, the national boundary divides the town, streets, and even some buildings. Famously, the border also runs through the Hotel Arbet, passing through a honeymoon suite dividing the bed in half. Another unique feature of a European country connects Spain to Portugal. At the border, people can take a zipline from Spain into Portugal. The zipline is the first cross-border zipline, which crosses over the Guadiana River. The Minho River also forms part of the border between Spain and Portugal. Seems like a fun border crossing if you ask me. Clearly, there are many intriguing borders present in Europe, many of which are freely crossed. Whether snowmobilers enjoy the paths or buildings and cafes are split in half, Europe has many unique borders to explore. But given that many of these unique borders were formed by treaties and contracts from several centuries ago, the New World shouldn't have any weird borders, right? Well, in North America, there are also some pretty incredible and interesting borders for us to explore. The US-Canada border in particular stands out, given its considerable length, but also because of what is known as the slash, which divides the countries visually. The border between the United States and Canada is the longest border in the world, stretching from Maine to Alaska and spanning through land, sea, and open wilderness. With so much wilderness, you might guess that this border would be left untouched by people, but this isn't the case. In fact, every year, American taxpayers pay, on average, half a cent to the International Boundary Commission solely to deforest every inch of the US-Canada border. With an annual budget totaling $1.4 million, the International Boundary Commission ensures that there is a clear line marking the US-Canada border. This line is known as the slash and is a treeless zone that is 20 feet wide and covers everything from isolated islands to steep hillsides. The slash is predominantly so remote that no one will ever visit the border, but the boundary is painstakingly maintained once every 6 years through hours of manual labor. The initial goal of the slash was to make sure the average person would know they are on the border. Beginning in the 1800s, when the western land section of the US and Canada border was set at the 49th parallel. The countries cut the slash and over 8,000 border markers were set out, with most still present today. However, without a GPS system back then, the border markers were inadvertently placed in a zigzag pattern, straying north or south from the official border by an average of 295 feet. Without sufficient cartography, the border came to have irregular cutoffs, such as Point Roberts and the Northwest Angle. Regardless of these errors, the slash is a popular destination for many who appreciate its geographical history. Another famously bizarre point in the border between the United States and Canada is at Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls is a massive, stunning cascade of waterfalls separating New York and Canada, where visitors can get terrific views from either the American or Canadian sides. border crossing is accessible via car, bike, or by foot on the Rainbow Bridge, which is open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Both sides have attractions to offer and stunning views of the falls, as well as rich culture and history. Clearly, the US-Canada border is quite unlike any other, but it's not the only unique border in North America. The US-Mexico border is actually the most deadly land migration route in the world, with hundreds losing their lives to perilous desert crossings. Last year, the International Organization for Migration recorded 686 deaths and disappearances, but this is limited because there's missing data. The area is very remote and dangerous, with much criminal and gang activity happening there. The 1,951-mile or 3,100-ish kilometer border is the busiest border in the world and is subject to more than 300 million people crossing it every year. Further, some parts of the border look very different on the other side, such as in the crowded urban Tijuana, Mexico, and the more abandoned, remote part of San Diego on the opposite side of the heavily policed border. The dichotomy between Mexican and American cities adjacent to the monitored border and its fences and walls built by American leaders demonstrates just how politicized a border and immigration can be. Needless to say, the southern border of the United States is completely different from the northern border with Canada. Another interesting border for the US is a sea border between the United States and Russia. You might be surprised to learn that two rocky islands, Big Diomede of Siberia and Little Diomede of Alaska, are just 2.4 miles or 3.8 kilometers apart in the Bering Strait. If you swam between the islands, you would jump 21 hours forward or backward in time, depending on which direction you swam. The islands lie on opposite sides of the international dateline. Big Diomede is called Tomorrow Island, and Little Diomede is known as Yesterday Island. This border, despite being just a few miles apart, is unique in how far apart these countries are in terms of time. These kinds of irregularities don't end there, though, and even more can be found in Latin America and the Caribbean. In Latin America and the Caribbean, there are also many intriguing borders and boundaries, some natural and some man-made. With 33 countries located in this region of the world, there surely are some borders worth noting. One such border exists between Costa Rica and Panama, which are separated by the Sixaola River. There are three main locations to cross the border: Paso Canoas in the west, Rio Sereno in the center, and Guabito in the east. To leave Costa Rica, the country imposes an impuesto, a departure tax, that must be paid before exiting the country by land, whether by car, foot, or bus. The tax is $8. The easternmost border crossing between the two countries at Sixaola is located just a few kilometers from the Caribbean Sea. What's unique about this crossing is that there's a rickety old bridge where travelers cross the river. The scenic views appeal to many tourists crossing the easternmost border between Costa Rica and Panama. Another interesting border exists where Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay meet, known as Tres Fronteras, or the Triple Frontier. Tres Fronteras is a famous border triangle. In this area, the connection of two of the continent's largest rivers, the Iguazu River and the Paraná River, intersect to make a triangular T-shaped border delineating the three countries' boundaries. The Triple Frontier is close to Iguazu Falls and some other natural gems that attract many tourists annually. Although the region is known for high levels of criminal activity, such as drug trafficking, money laundering, and theft of intellectual property, the region is known for being ethnically diverse, with tourists in 3 cities in the 3 different countries converging. The local cities recently constructed a recreational complex where visitors can glimpse neighboring countries, each with an obelisk embellished with the colors of each nation's respective flag. The center is called Ito Tres Fronteras Park and allows tourists to see a 180-degree panoramic view of the surrounding area. At the viewing platform, visitors can see into the thick rainforests of Brazil and Argentina. Slightly south of the tri-point lies the Puente de la Integración, also known as the Integration Bridge, which was inaugurated in 2022. The 760-meter-long bridge connects Paraguay with Brazil, as does the more congested Friendship Bridge that lies upstream. Without a doubt, the triple frontier of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay is one of the world's most intriguing borders, both geographically and culturally. Another notable border is that of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which share a border and an island. Because there's been much more deforestation in Haiti and limited deforestation in the Dominican Republic, an aerial view of the island can be breathtaking. But the geographic divide is not all that stands out at the Haiti-Dominican border. In September of 2023, the Dominican Republic shut all land, air, and sea borders with Haiti over a dispute regarding a canal being constructed on Haitian soil that tapped into a shared river. The diplomatic crisis over the canal diverting water from the river was said to negatively affect Dominican farmers and the local environment. Despite this conflict, there is a strong connection between the neighboring countries at the border. Haiti is the Dominican Republic's third largest trading partner, with $1 billion in exports going to Haiti in 2022 and $11 million in imports, on top of $430 million in informal border trade happening at the border as of 2017. The border between the countries is also associated with illegal border crossings, human trafficking, and contraband sales, which all make the border distinctive. Beyond this, the Dominican Republic has begun to build a 118-mile wall along the border. Clearly, borders are more than mere geological divides between forest and deforestation. They're more than just a wall built to divide countries. Borders are symbols of economic exchange, political conflict, and separation of resources. Like the rigid divide between deforestation and healthy forests seen between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, the same can be observed in an aerial view of Brazil and Bolivia. The heavy deforestation in Brazil compared with the biodiverse forests in Bolivia visibly demonstrate an environmental divergence between the two countries. The Papiriguazu River separates the two countries and their vastly different-looking forest land. To the south of Brazil and Bolivia's wooded boundary lies the border between Argentina and Chile. There, a much more bizarre boundary marks the border. A statue of Jesus Christ marks the boundary between Argentina and Chile. The statue was unveiled in 1904 as a symbol of peaceful settlement of the border dispute between the countries and is known as Christ the Redeemer of the Andes. It stands at the summit of La Cumbre Pass, located in the Andes Mountains. The statue was commissioned by the Catholic Church and was created by sculptor Mateo Alonso of Buenos Aires. A Spanish inscription reading, "Sooner shall these mountains crumble into dust than Chileans and Argentinians break the peace which at the feet of Christ, the Redeemer, they have sworn to maintain," is located at the bottom of the statue. Clearly, Latin America, like many other parts of the world, is home to many unusual and interesting borders. Whether rivers, statues, or deforestation, there are many ways that boundaries between countries in Latin America look. It's clear that national boundaries can widely differ. In some places, borders are heavily militarized, protected, and contested. Walls, fences, and heavily armed guards all divide the countries from one another. On the other hand, some borders are divided naturally by geological features like mountains and rivers or by stripes of selective deforestation. Some nations are landlocked by other nations, while others are bizarrely integrated with one another. Borders can also uniquely impact our sense of time, skipping hours ahead or behind at different boundaries. At other boundaries, flags, statues, drawn lines, and massive art displays delineate national borders. And in some places, people can freely cross borders between countries, whether by walking, zipline, or bridge. As you can tell, borders look very different in different parts of the world. Borders tell us stories, telling us of relationships between such bordering countries. Borders take many shapes and forms. Perhaps every border is unique in its own way, with no two borders being quite alike.
The protection of the U.S. border, particularly the section within Texas, is a hotly debated topic in American society. There are plenty of ideas, with everyone thinking they have the right answer. Illegal migrants, criminals, drugs, the wall, the lack of control, or, on the contrary, the bloated power apparatus. These are the bad associations Americans have about the border today. Indeed, this topic has arisen during political campaigns at multiple levels, especially with former U.S. President Trump in recent years. The problem of protecting state borders from several threats is not unique to the United States and has been tackled by many countries. Yet currently, there are many solutions to this domestic challenge, but so far, none of them have been convincingly proven to be effective in the U.S. What makes this so difficult to achieve? Before we can discover why it's so hard to protect the border, we need to first understand why the border needs to be protected. The United States-Mexico border is one of the most frequently crossed borders globally, primarily due to strong economic and familial connections between the two nations. In 2006, there were nearly 250 million recorded legal border crossings, and data suggests that this number can surpass 350 million annually. These countries have become pivotal trading partners, with trade steadily increasing, largely due to the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and the shift of manufacturing to Mexico. In 2012, it was estimated that approximately 350,000 illegal immigrants from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Ecuador entered the United States each year. The number of unauthorized border crossings fluctuates, influenced by changes in U.S. policies and global crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Texas is the primary entry point for unauthorized immigrants into the United States, and addressing this issue demands significant resources and cooperation among federal, state, and local authorities. The border region also faces persistent challenges, such as the smuggling of weapons south to Mexico and drug trafficking from South America. Texas serves as a major corridor for drug trafficking from Mexico into the United States. In 2022, the Drug Enforcement Administration reported intercepting 379 million potentially lethal doses of fentanyl, an exceptionally potent and addictive drug. This substance is considered the most lethal threat to the United States, with over 4,500 kilograms seized per hour, including more than 50.6 million tablets disguised as various painkillers. This marked a significant increase from 2021. The administration believes that a substantial portion of the fentanyl is produced in clandestine facilities in Mexico by the Sinaloa and Jalisco drug cartels, using ingredients imported from China. In 2021, over 100,000 Americans died from drug overdoses, with two-thirds of these fatalities linked to fentanyl. The quantity of fentanyl seized in 2022 is sufficient to potentially cause harm to every U.S. resident, and it's widely believed that much of this fentanyl enters the United States from Mexico. This pervasive issue places Texas at the forefront of combating this illicit drug trade, which can be exceptionally challenging due to the resources and expertise of the drug cartels. The border region is also a significant hub for human trafficking, including the dangerous and exploitative smuggling of individuals across the border. As a result, the U.S.-Mexico border is heavily guarded, especially on the U.S. side, in comparison to the U.S.-Canada border. Efforts to actively enhance border security commenced at the local level in the early 1990s. The issue of illegal immigration gained significant prominence during the 1992 presidential election campaign, featuring candidates George H.W. Bush, Republican, and Bill Clinton, Democrat. Both parties had many supporters advocating for increased border security. Subsequently, the federal government implemented its initial border security measures. Notably, Operation Gatekeeper was launched by Bill Clinton in 1994. On September 30, 1996, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act came into effect, following approval by the 104th U.S. Congress. The first border barriers were constructed in California, Arizona, and Texas. Additional funds from the U.S. federal budget were allocated for new deportation facilities, and several hundred Border Patrol agents were deployed to California and Arizona. The expansion of border security led to a shift where more immigrants settled permanently in the USA, compared to their previous practice of crossing the border temporarily, often for agricultural work, and returning to Mexico after the season and harvest. Following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, border security became a priority from a counterterrorism perspective, prompting increased funding. In September 2006, the Secure Fence Act of 2006 was passed by Congress, allowing for an additional 700 miles, 1,100 kilometers, of border fence to be constructed. President George W. Bush signed this act into law on October 26, 2006. His successor, Barack Obama, also supported this legislation, and throughout his 8-year administration, border protection efforts were consistently expanded. A 2013 study commissioned by the Council on Foreign Relations revealed that border guards apprehended approximately half of illegal immigrants in 2010. Donald Trump, who served as U.S. President from January 2017 to January 2021, sought to fulfill one of his campaign promises: the construction, addition, and expansion of existing structures along the approximately 2,000-mile-long, 3,200 kilometers U.S. southern border. On March 24, 2017, he issued an executive order to initiate construction. According to a press release by the United States Department of Homeland Security, in mid-March 2017, the proposed wall would reach a height of up to 29.5 feet, For comparison, the Berlin Wall was approximately 13 feet high, and the barriers between Israel and the Gaza Strip reach up to 29.5 feet. The cost was estimated to range from $12 billion to $21 billion. However, Trump encountered challenges in securing significant funding from his party for wall construction in the initial U.S. budget of his term, as the 2017 budget did not allocate funds for expanding the border wall. In 2018, Congress approved relatively small amounts of money for expanding border facilities. In 2019, President Trump invoked his powers in response to a national emergency, enabling him to divert funds from the defense budget for border expansion. By the end of Donald Trump's presidency, official figures indicated that 452 miles of border facilities had been reconstructed by January 2021. However, only about 80 miles of this were built entirely from scratch, with 47 miles constituting a border wall and 33 miles serving as additional reinforcement for existing barriers. The remaining 372 miles involved renovations to pre-existing border structures. Did Trump's successor continue the project? Initially, the border wall seemed like it had no future. On January 20th, 2021, his first day in office, President Biden immediately halted further construction of the wall. He had even stated, "There will not be another foot of wall constructed on my administration." With time, however, that turned out not to be the case, as we will explain. It's important to note that while he vowed no more wall would be built, the sections of the wall that had been completed were not dismantled. As Biden continued into his first term as president, it was soon clear that there was a significant increase in the number of refugees crossing the border. That trend has continued to today, with the U.S. Border Patrol having apprehended 181,059 people along the southern border in August, compared with 132,648 in July of the previous year. In total, more than 2.2 million immigrants have been detained since the beginning of the current fiscal year, which began in October 2022. The Biden administration has also announced that it will resume deportations of illegal Venezuelan migrants. This has clearly become an increasing issue, so what steps have been taken? In January 2023, during a visit to El Paso, President Biden announced his intent to introduce third country transit regulations. The wall construction has also been resumed, albeit against the president's wishes. During the presidency of Donald Trump in 2019, funds were allocated for the border wall construction, and since then, Congress has refused to distribute it to other areas. Biden is later quoted saying he can't stop construction because the law requires the funding to be used and completed in 2023. The combined efforts of various leaders gave rise to a political agenda where the preferred policy of managing immigration is through border enforcement. The extensive and intensive application of this strategy led to a notable increase in apprehensions, subsequently serving as a rationale for heightened enforcement measures and the full-scale militarization of the Mexico-U.S. border. Paradoxically, this militarization did not succeed in reducing undocumented entries, but instead decreased the rate of return migration by legal persons. Consequently, the decrease of legal travel between countries amplified the net rate of unauthorized migration and contributed to the expansion of the undocumented population. Simultaneously, it prompted alterations in patterns of border crossings and destination preferences. Ultimately, the once circular migration of male laborers to a select few states transformed into the settlement of families dispersed throughout the nation. This does not, however, explain what makes the act of protecting the Texas border so difficult. It's a complex challenge influenced by several persistent factors. A fundamental aspect of this challenge is the chronic nature of issues related to illegal immigration and drug cartels, which do not simply disappear. When these crises worsen intermittently, it becomes challenging to adapt border security systems. So why has there been a sustained need for border security for more than 3 decades? In 2017, with the inauguration of Donald Trump, the number of illegal immigrants detained at the U.S.-Mexico border was at its lowest point in 45 years. However, this decline was short-lived and migration began to increase once more. Since the beginning of 2019, the border situation has notably deteriorated, with the majority of migrants originating from 3 Central American nations: Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Migrants often struggle to pinpoint a single motivating factor prompting them to leave their homes and embark on a perilous journey into the unknown, risking their lives and possessions while traversing Mexico, where they face threats from local gangs. These Central American countries grapple with a myriad of issues. Historically, the primary driver of mass migration to the USA has been the stark disparity in economic development and wage levels. The GDP per capita in Central American countries is approximately 1/10 of that in the USA. In economies with limited opportunities for working-age individuals, the United States, experiencing a labor shortage, serves as an attractive destination. Migration rates are, therefore, closely tied to the economic situation in the USA. When job opportunities abound, migration surges, and conversely, when economic conditions worsen, migration can decrease significantly, although it doesn't stop completely. Even during the economic crisis in the USA in 2007, migration from Central America persisted, albeit at a reduced pace. Now, let's explore more deeply into what's happening in Central America that's driving up their populations. The situation there is very bad. Approximately 70 to 75% of the population of Honduras and Guatemala and 41% of the population of El Salvador live below the poverty line, particularly in rural areas inhabited mainly by indigenous peoples who often receive minimal support from the state. These rural regions are particularly affected by the emerging factor driving migration: climate change. Some areas now experience an entire year's worth of rainfall in a single day, leading to soil erosion and crop destruction. In other areas, months may pass without precipitation, causing the dry corridor across Central America to expand. As a result, traditional crops no longer yield harvests, leaving few alternatives for the affected communities. Some individuals attempt to seek employment in urban areas, but this entails paying tribute to local gangs that control these troubled neighborhoods and recruiting the children of migrants. Consequently, many perceive leaving for the USA as their only option, especially when they have relatives and friends already residing there. Many individuals risk their lives as the terrain they must traverse can be unforgiving. Migrants seeking entry into the United States face a decision. They can either request asylum at an official border crossing or attempt to evade detection and enter the country unlawfully. According to U.S. law, entry cannot be denied if there is even a slight reason, a 10% rating on the fear scale, to believe that one's life is in danger in their home country. If the migrant passes the initial screening successfully, their case will be scheduled for review in a special court. Detained migrants commonly exercise their right to seek asylum, thereby avoiding immediate deportation. This process, however, has become more and more difficult, as wait times have gotten longer and longer. Therefore, many migrants seek alternative options, attempting to enter the country through illegal means. However, implementing more extensive employment programs could alleviate the border's burden, safeguard migrant rights, and address the U.S. demand for low-cost labor. This is a good idea in theory, but one major question has to be addressed. How can the U.S. stop more dangerous criminals from slipping across the border? Drug cartels exhibit a high degree of organization, financial strength, operational efficiency, and an uncompromising nature. Their dominance in the global drug trade dates back to the 1980s, and the United States has been engaged in a protracted battle against them for an extended period. As of March 2021, information furnished by U.S. Customs and Border Protection indicated that cartels and human trafficking organizations were believed to be generating close to $14 million daily by facilitating the illegal transportation of individuals across the southern border. These ruthless international cartels amass billions of dollars annually through the exploitation, hardship, and mistreatment of migrants. Additionally, the majority of illicit drugs and narcotics are introduced into the United States via the southern border. Perhaps surprisingly, the Drug Enforcement Administration has stated that most drugs enter the United States through official ports of entry. Smugglers transport prohibited cargo in private cars or trucks. The cartels have their bases in various countries in Latin America and are quite influential, as indicated by the large spending budgets implemented to fight against them. While thus far it may sound like the U.S. is in this fight alone, is that true? Or are there other organizations the U.S. can or does align with to help offset the sway cartels have over the area? Unfortunately, there's not a broad consensus with other stakeholders on how to best address the border crisis. The Mexican government, for instance, lacks an incentive to curb immigration, as the money sent back to their homeland by immigrants amounts to billions of dollars annually, and immigration also helps reduce unemployment in the country. Various Hispanic and human rights organizations in the United States express concerns about discrimination and heightened tensions. Environmental groups voice objections, and American agricultural companies strongly oppose stricter border controls. According to experts from the University of California at Davis, a significant portion of the country's agricultural workforce consists of undocumented migrant laborers. Additionally, various sectors of the U.S. economy derive benefits from the utilization of illegal labor. Studies indicate that undocumented immigrants expand the scale of the U.S. economy, foster economic expansion, improve the well-being of native citizens, generate more tax revenue than they receive, diminish the motivation of American companies to relocate jobs overseas and import foreign manufactured products, and offer advantages to consumers by lowering the cost of goods and services. At the same time, there are people who are not satisfied with such things and are aggressively trying to protect the border of Texas. For over 2 years, Governor Greg Abbott has been pushing the boundaries of what a state can do to enforce immigration laws. In March of 2021, the governor launched Operation Lone Star, which issued a disaster declaration covering most of the counties along the border. This gave him the authority to deploy the Texas National Guard to the border, and the Texas Department of Public Safety, and the Texas Military Department the responsibility to run the operation. This initiative has garnered widespread support in Texas, even among some Democrats. However, the associated cost, which has already exceeded $4 billion, is projected to exceed $9 billion by the end of the next year. He has overseen proactive efforts by state police officers at the border to deter migration and has boldly challenged federal authorities by placing a floating barrier in the middle of the Rio Grande. In the small border city of Eagle Pass, state police cleared vegetation from a sandbar in the river to establish a new security outpost. The more aggressive tactics face their first significant challenge from the federal government, which filed a lawsuit against the state of Texas. The lawsuit contends that the floating barrier in the river violates federal law and possesses a risk to U.S. foreign policy. The federal government filed a motion seeking an immediate injunction to order the removal of the barrier. These newly intensified strategies have tested the support that the governor's immigration policies have historically enjoyed in Texas. Nonetheless, the ramped-up tactics, along with reports of migrants facing harsh treatment by Texas officers and incidents involving injuries related to razor wire, have eroded some of that support. Legal experts have noted that Governor Abbott's actions have already pushed the boundaries of state authority on immigration and may, in some instances, have exceeded those boundaries. In October 2023, Governor Abbott ordered the Texas National Guard to install a barrier in certain areas along the Texas-New Mexico state line. Officials reported that Guard members had been placing concertina wire in a region near Sunland Park, New Mexico, which shares a border with El Paso, Texas. These actions are regarded by many as unconstitutional, politically motivated, and wasteful, while others express support and approval. But whether one supports or opposes the policies that have been put in place, there are some geological features that present an immense challenge to anyone trying to secure the border. The U.S.-Mexico border spans a total length of 1,954 miles, 3,145 kilometers, with additional maritime boundaries extending 18 miles, 30 kilometers, into the Pacific Ocean and 12 miles, 19 kilometers, into the Gulf of Mexico. It's one of the longest international borders between two countries globally. Among U.S. states, Texas boasts the longest border with Mexico, accounting for roughly 1,254 miles, which is nearly two-thirds of the entire border. This extensive border takes on various geographical characteristics as it courses through different regions: El Paso Juarez metropolitan area, El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. Initiating in the westernmost sector, the border encompasses the urban expanse of El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico. The Rio Grande River delineates this divide, with multiple bridges and border crossings connecting the two cities. Big Bend region advancing eastward, the border traverses the remote and rugged Big Bend region, celebrated for its awe-inspiring desert vistas, profound canyons, and the iconic Big Bend National Park. The Rio Grande winds its way through these canyons, forming a natural border in this sparsely populated territory. Laredo-Nuevo Laredo border crossing. Continuing eastward, the border showcases the vibrant border cities of Laredo, Texas, and Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, Mexico. The World Trade International Bridge facilitates the connection between these cities, rendering it a major center for trade and transportation. Rio Grande Valley. As we move into the southeastern section of Texas, the border encompasses the lush Rio Grande Valley, renowned for its agricultural productivity. This area is home to numerous border crossings, including the McAllen-Hidalgo-Reynosa International Bridge, Brownsville-Matamoros border crossing. At the easternmost point of the Texas-Mexico border, the cities of Brownsville, Texas, and Matamoros, Tamaulipas stand across from one another, separated by the Rio Grande River. The Brownsville-Matamoros International Bridge serves as a critical conduit for trade and travel between the United States and Mexico. This extensive and diverse border region plays a pivotal role in the intersections between the two countries, shaping their economic, cultural, and political ties. It encompasses a range of terrains, from arid deserts to bountiful river valleys, and has a rich history of trade, migration, and cultural exchange. The U.S.-Mexico border's dynamic nature underscores the complexities of the relationship between the two nations. Such a huge length of the border and its diversity create a huge number of questions and problems regarding the idea of its protection. The U.S. Border Patrol raises concerns about enduring issues related to inadequate funding and a shortage of personnel. On average, there are approximately 4 personnel members per mile of the border, with the majority of them concentrated in heavily populated regions. In contrast, extensive desert and mountainous areas remain sparsely patrolled. Migrants traverse the border in various ways, either in small groups or as part of larger gatherings, often referred to as caravans, which can comprise of thousands of individuals. The issue of personnel shortages becomes evident through the shortcomings of the Trump border wall. It proved ineffective for various foreseeable reasons. In these less patrolled areas, migrants resorted to inexpensive ladders to surmount it, or they scaled it without any cost. They employed affordable power tools to breach it, cutting through small sections to squeeze through, and slicing through larger segments for vehicle passage. In a particular, relatively small stretch in 2020, they sawed through the wall at least 18 times, a fact known to Border Patrol. Additionally, they constructed tunnels, with some tunnels being extensive, including the longest one ever found, while others were short enough to bypass the barrier. Thus, these methods result in situations where a segment of the Trump border wall in southern Texas had an extravagant cost of $27 million per mile. But it is being circumvented by the use of a homemade ladder. This, however, is not the only issue facing a border wall, as another more natural problem arises. To build a well-protected wall, billions of dollars are needed. To guard against it, a significant increase in personnel is required. Also, if part of the wall is damaged, it will need to be repaired. From time to time, the wall will also need to be regularly updated and improved. Therefore, there's not much evidence supporting that an increase in border wall spending will decrease illegal crossing. But in fairness, this is not the first border wall ever attempted, and we can see if lessons learned in other countries have yielded positive results. Today, there are more than 60 physical barriers to crossing national borders in the world, while in 1989 there were only 6. Most of the world's border barriers are not walls, but very tall and fortified fences, including Trump's creation. Perhaps the most famous real concrete wall separates Israel from the Palestinian territories. In 1994, it surrounded the Gaza Strip, and in 2011 to 2015, fortifications were built on the borders with Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. Israel justifies this policy as a defense against terrorism, while other international organizations, including the UN, believe that it significantly complicates the lives of the Palestinian people. Syria is surrounded on almost all sides by border fortifications. In 2014, to protect against migrants and terrorists, the wall promised by President Recep Tayyip Erdogan began to be built on the Syrian-Turkish border. Unlike the Trump one, this is really a wall, not a fence. In addition, Iraq and Jordan have fenced off Syria. Fences around the Spanish enclaves of Morocco, Ceuta, and Melilla are designed to contain the flow of migrants. However, they often turn out to be ineffective because the fortifications only reach the edge of the sea, so they can be crossed by boats or walked around at low tide. Poland has built a wall on the border with Belarus to block the influx of migrants who are trying to illegally enter the EU country. Human rights activists and experts criticize the wall and insist that it will not be able to solve the problem of the influx of migrants into Poland. The most famous fence in the world was the Berlin Wall. Its main goal was to prevent residents of East Berlin from escaping to West Berlin. But even under the threat of execution, people would overcome the most guarded wall in the world. 28 people escaped through a 476-foot-long tunnel they dug themselves, flew on a hang glider in a balloon made of nylon fragments, on a rope thrown between the windows of neighboring houses, and used bulldozers to ram walls. So while the effectiveness of border walls and fences have varied, perhaps a solution can be found by studying the border of the United States' northern neighbor, Canada. The United States and Canada share a border commonly referred to as a largely undefined border. Although this description is accurate primarily in a military context, as civilian law enforcement agencies are active at the border. Crossing the border outside of designated checkpoints is unlawful, as individuals crossing the border are required to undergo scrutiny and official inspection. It's noteworthy that the rate of security measures rises noticeably along the border between the US and Mexico, which is roughly one-third the length of the US-Canada border. The US-Canada border spans diverse geographic regions. Portions of the border pass through wooded areas in the northwest, prairies, the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence River, and out into the Atlantic Oceans, including icy regions. The border also traverses the territory of the Akwesasne Nation and demarcates the boundary between Vermont and Quebec. In the aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks, both nations significantly bolstered security measures along the border, focusing on urban and rural regions. The two countries also engage in the exchange of strategic and tactical intelligence information on the ground. In 2010, the United States and Canada collaborated on a project titled Beyond the Border, a shared vision for perimeter security and economic competitiveness, aiming to enhance border control and immigration information sharing between the two nations. It's clear that an alignment of goals, as well as a lack of humanitarian crises, have resulted in a much more stable border to the north. So this all begs the question, is it really possible to completely protect the southern border? Given the many issues facing immigrants attempting to enter the United States, the political divide with how to deal with the issue, and the geographic and financial roadblocks that have to be navigated, it doesn't appear that a short-term solution is feasible. The extensive militarization of the Mexico-US border not only failed to achieve its goal of reducing undocumented migration, but had adverse consequences. One long-term way to combat organized crime and excessive migration is to help neighboring countries to provide more support and protection for their own citizens. Instead of impeding the demonstrated inclination of the typical Mexican worker to engage in temporary back-and-forth labor movements to the United States, alternative policies could have been implemented to encourage return migration. These could include reducing the costs and risks associated with sending earnings back to Mexico, offering tax refunds to migrants who return, granting legal immigration access to U.S. entitlements even if they return to Mexico, and collaborating with Mexican authorities to create appealing opportunities for savings and investments within Mexico. The billions of dollars spent on counterproductive border enforcement might have been more wisely allocated to structural adjustments funds directed towards Mexico. These funds could have been utilized to enhance Mexico's infrastructure in areas such as public health, education, transportation, communication, banking, and insurance. These investments could have contributed to a more robust, productive, and prosperous North America, ultimately addressing the root causes of migration, which are currently tied to ineffective insurance, capital, and credit markets. Now go watch How the USA Will Be Overtaken by Mexico, or Why United States and Canada Have the Strangest Border in the World.
In 2022, over 817,000 people left California. At the same time, New York experienced a net loss of around 75,000 families. Houses on the northeast and west coast of the United States were once the most sought-after residences in the nation. Now, people are leaving these areas in droves to live a less expensive and more fulfilling life. Where are people going? Why are they leaving? And could this signal a fundamental shift in the way the United States looks and operates? Over the years, large cities in the United States have both grown and shrunk in size depending on the current state of affairs in the country. However, the mass exodus in several metropolitan areas is becoming a major concern for several states. Where there were once lucrative opportunities and an abundance of workers, there's now a scramble to secure talent and a mad dash to keep people from moving away. Out of the 88 US cities with populations over 250,000, 77 showed signs of a slowdown in growth rate or decline in population over the last several years. This means that 87.5% of US cities could see a severe reduction in their populations within the next decade or two. This wasn't always the case, so what events caused this trend to begin? Early in the 2000s, city populations had gone into decline due to how easy it was for home buyers to obtain credit, creating a boom in the suburban housing market. However, this exodus out of cities was caused by an illusion. Banks were giving out loans with incredibly high interest rates to people who were at risk of not being able to make their payments in full. This all came to a head in 2008 when the housing market collapsed, causing banks to lose more than $1 trillion from bad loans and toxic assets. Between January of 2007 and September of 2009, people were kicked out of their homes as banks foreclosed on their properties. They were forced into apartments or alternate living situations until they could once again make ends meet. As the United States recovered from the Great Recession, cities grew. The suburbs were no longer seen as an option for many as regulators came down hard on banks for giving out bad loans. And homeownership was and continues to be an expensive proposition. Many millennials decided to remain in cities as they pushed their plans to start a family to later in life and instead focused on their careers. But in 2012, things started to change once again. Cities saw an overall decline in growth rate, culminating in 2021 and 2022, when US cities saw a population decline of 0.95%. This was the first time in history that the overall city population in the United States had declined. Right off the bat, it's clear that 3 different states could be in big trouble. California and New York saw the largest number of moves out of their states in 2022. In fact, California lost 343,000 residents last year alone. Now, this is just a drop in the bucket, as California still has a population of around 39.2 million people living within its borders. But this trend is part of a much larger problem, as New York lost 300,000 of its 19.8 million residents in 2022. The trend of residents moving out of certain parts of the country has been occurring for a few years now. One very obvious reason for this is that people began moving out of cities and more densely populated areas in 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic began. The problem is many didn't come back, and even after the pandemic ended in the United States, many families decided they didn't want to live in cities anymore. Instead, more and more individuals continued migrating away from urban centers to other parts of the country. So, what states are losing population and which are gaining? Let's now examine 10 states that have experienced the largest loss of residents before diving deeper into the data to uncover why this phenomenon is happening in certain regions of the US and not others. In 2021, California had a net loss of over 101,000 households. One of the major reasons why people move is for better job opportunities, but that's not what's happening in this state. California has a GDP of around $3.6 trillion, making up about 14.3% of the total US economy. There's no lack of job opportunities, and it's hard to argue with the climate in many of the state's most populated regions. However, when we zoom in, the data suggests that the Golden State could be in for troubling times. In 2022, around 40,000 people moved out of San Francisco, and it's not surprising. Depending on the metrics used for the cost of living, San Francisco falls somewhere in the top 3 most expensive cities to live in the United States. This is because lucrative tech companies monopolize most of the real estate and businesses. The city is home to or close to numerous tech headquarters, and talented coders, engineers, and entrepreneurs call this place home. Unfortunately, what this means for the rest of the population is that prices have skyrocketed, and now it's all but impossible to afford property in the area. In fact, the median cost of buying a house in San Francisco is $1.4 million, which is just not attainable for most people. It's these crazy prices that have caused many San Francisco residents to leave the city for more space at less cost. Los Angeles has a similar problem. It's estimated that Los Angeles residents spend around an hour in traffic every day. That's not time spent commuting, it's just time stuck in traffic. On top of the hours spent in the car, the city itself is incredibly expensive. The average price for an apartment is $3,093 a month, and that isn't even to own the place you're living in. People renting in LA will never get a return on the money spent on rent, which is true everywhere else in the world. And things are just getting worse as rents increased by an average of $443 in 2022, which has priced many people out of the city they've called home for years. As mentioned at the beginning of this video, the state of New York suffered a net loss of over 75,000 families in 2022. Most of this population decline was in New York City and the surrounding areas. The reason for this has to do with people's ability to work remotely during the pandemic and the desire to be closer to family. That being said, there is one reason above all others that is forcing families to leave the Big Apple and move to more affordable parts of the country. New York City is the most expensive city in the country to live in. This is why more than 20,000 residents left the metropolis last year alone. Now, many companies are struggling to find experienced talent willing to come back to the office to work. However, even lucrative work opportunities don't seem to be enticing people to move to the city or to the surrounding areas. The cost of living is unsustainable, resulting in over 100,000 apartments being left empty, even though the Department of Homeless Services has 67,880 children and adults living in their facilities in 2022. Unfortunately, many people don't have the option of moving out of the city for various reasons, but if everyone was given the opportunity, it's very probable that New York City would lose a lot more than just 20,000 residents. Metropolitan areas of Illinois, such as Chicago, are struggling to keep residents within their borders. Indiana saw a net decline of around 29,000 families in 2021, and data from 2022 suggests that this trend has continued. When a sample of movers was polled on the major reasons why they were leaving the state, around 50% cited taxes as the primary factor causing them to move. Even though the cost of living in Illinois isn't quite as high as California and New York, financial factors have been driving the exodus of people out of state. Pennsylvania's population declined by more than 18,000 households, which can be directly connected to job losses during the pandemic. The interesting thing is that it doesn't appear Pennsylvanians are flocking to New York or other major metropolitan hubs where jobs are more plentiful due to the fact that these regions are experiencing population decline. Like in most parts of the country where states are losing residents, it appears that people from Pennsylvania are looking towards some key states to their south to restart their lives and careers. Massachusetts has the largest population of any state in New England. In fact, Boston and Worcester are the two largest cities in New England, with respective populations of 650,700 and 205,320 people. However, this might also be a contributing factor as to why the state lost 15,489 households last year. In total, this equates to around 57,000 residents moving out of Massachusetts in 2022 alone. What the data shows is that the most populous state in New England is losing more residents than it's gaining. Again, when we conduct our analysis, we'll examine why this is happening. But what's important to know is that when you include New York's economy, which makes up over 8% of the United States' overall GDP, and Massachusetts' economy, which comprises almost 3% of the national GDP, the loss of such large numbers of workers could be detrimental to the United States economy in the future. Washington state is interesting as the reason for people moving out of the state is clear. The 13,000 families that left Washington last year didn't go very far. Instead, the majority went to the neighboring states of Oregon and Idaho, where the cost of living is significantly lower. It's been determined that it's around 7% cheaper to live in Oregon than in Washington, and Idaho is one of the lowest cost states to live in the western part of the country. Many Washington residents decided to move when given the option of living in a cheaper state while working remotely. And now those same people are refusing to move back to Washington even if it could cost them their jobs. These states followed a similar pattern to the ones previously mentioned. Residents moved away from larger urban areas and took up residence in states where the cost of living was lower than where they came from. Approximately 12,145 families left Colorado in 2022. Just under 12,000 families moved out of Indiana. Michigan's population declined by about 11,000 households, and Wisconsin lost about 10,000 families. Washington, D.C. is its own city and federal district. However, even the capital of the United States has been losing residents. In a city that should have numerous government programs and opportunities, people are finding it harder and harder to make ends meet. This has led to 15,000 people moving out of D.C. in 2022 alone. In fact, even the states surrounding D.C. saw a population loss. Virginia lost 24,000 residents, and Maryland's population decreased by 4,500 people. Many commuters to D.C. come from these two states, which is worrying for the future of the nation's capital. What's most unsettling about the data thus far is that many of these states contain one or more of the nation's largest cities. There's clearly a correlation between states with big cities and a decline in population over the last few years. In fact, 8 out of the 10 largest cities in the US lost residents in recent years, with Phoenix, Arizona, and San Antonio, Texas being the 2 exceptions. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Philadelphia, San Diego, Dallas, and San Jose all saw a decline in their populations. What's happening in these big cities is becoming the norm instead of the exception in terms of population loss. In general, larger cities are seeing either a drastic decline in incoming residents or are now experiencing a loss. There's nothing pleasing about living in a city with numerous rundown buildings decaying from neglect as people move out en masse. Unfortunately, this could be the future for many major metropolitan areas in the United States. That being said, this could be a short-term trend, and city growth might continue in the future. However, this doesn't seem to be the most likely scenario for reasons we're about to discuss. Let's take a look at where all of these people are moving to. There's no single location where the majority of people are moving to as they flee the states previously mentioned. We know that the Northeast and West Coast are being hit hard, but the middle of the country is also seeing a population decline in major cities like Chicago. Even so, all of the people moving out of cities need to go somewhere. So, where are they going to? The simple answer is that people are moving south. The more complicated answer is that people are moving to key locations offering cheaper houses, jobs, and reasonable taxes. So let's take a look at where the mass migration of people from cities are ending up. The states with the largest amount of new residents are in the southeastern United States and Texas. Number 1 is Florida, where 319,000 new residents moved in 2022. Texas saw an influx of 230,000 residents. Both North and South Carolina also saw a large number of new residents enter their borders, as well as Georgia. North Carolina gained almost 100,000 new residents, while South Carolina saw an increase of 84,000 people. Remember, this is during the same time period that New York and California are losing hundreds of thousands of residents each. When we zoom in on the states that are seeing an influx of new residents, we can pinpoint the exact counties that people are moving to. Unsurprisingly, Americans aren't leaving cities to move to new cities. They're settling down in areas with more undeveloped land and relatively cheap properties. To be fair, people aren't building their own houses or even moving into single-family homes. A lot of the new residents in these states are buying or renting condos and apartments, but things are very different in this part of the country than in the major urban centers where people are leaving. For example, Ocala, Florida saw a 57.1% inbound move rate. This area is about halfway between Orlando and Gainesville, 2 major cities in Florida. However, most people moving to this county are staying away from the cities for the most part. They may work in one of the major urban centers, but that's not where they purchased or rented their homes. This is a trend in other places that saw major increases in residents as well. Tallahassee, Florida had an inbound rate of 56.6%, even though it's the capital of Florida. However, upon closer inspection, the regions being moved to are not in the city itself, but in more rural areas. In fact, the city of Tallahassee saw a decrease in inbound movers. Then there are the Charlotte, Gastonia, and Concord regions of North and South Carolina, which had a 56.6% inbound mover rate. Again, there are pockets where the population declined in these areas, but this only happened near heavily populated urban centers. People from across the country and within the counties themselves are looking to move further away from cities where housing is cheaper. There are major cities in Texas like Dallas that are seeing declines in residents, but Texas is a huge state with a ton of land. The allure is that much of this land is cheap, but the downside is that everyone needs a car if they aren't living within the metro area. This has led to mega highways being built and traffic jams that extend for miles. However, the benefits of living in more rural Texas seem to outweigh the costs, as huge numbers of people are moving to the state to get away from city life. So we know people are moving, but let's dig deeper into the reasons why. It actually comes as no surprise that people are leaving states like California and New York for the South when you look at housing statistics. In general, anyone living in New York typically saves huge amounts of money by moving to another state. It's estimated that housing costs are around 15 times lower in most states compared to New York. This could translate into saving $18,300 a year just by moving. And here is where we get into the crux of why people in the US are fleeing states with large cities. When surveyed, around half of the people who moved in 2021 stated that high housing costs led them to leave cities and expensive neighborhoods. This resulted in searches for cheaper housing and larger living spaces, all of which are more attainable in states like the Carolinas, Florida, and Texas. However, these statistics can be broken down even further. There are actually 3 reasons why US citizens are leaving certain states for others. According to moving statistics in 2021, the majority of movers cited work-related reasons for moving. However, when we dive into the data, it seems that other factors combined with jobs are driving the exodus out of certain US states. Between 2019 and 2021, work-related moves declined by nearly 19%, which indicates that although jobs are a main factor as to why people are moving, it's becoming less prevalent than it once was. We know that families are moving from cities with numerous job opportunities to regions with relatively fewer jobs. This may seem counterintuitive, but these statistics can be deceiving, as it's not just workers who are moving south, but companies as well. The Sun Belt is quickly becoming one of the most thriving job markets in the country. The states we've identified as being where people are moving to were some of the first regions to recover after the pandemic, and it's estimated that there are around 5% more jobs in places like the Carolinas, Florida, and Texas than before the pandemic started. The job markets in the southern regions that people have moved to recently recovered about twice as fast as the rest of the country. Job opportunities and better work-life balance have definitely contributed to these states being a refuge for people escaping from the cities. But there is another perk that people moving to southern counties with booming economies get to enjoy. In Florida, there is no individual state income tax, which means residents of the state only need to pay federal income tax. This is a big plus for people who either live paycheck to paycheck or are trying to save for the future. There are definitely funding problems for social programs that come with this model of low taxes in the Sunshine State, but if the main goal is to move someplace with a strong job market and low taxes, Florida checks both of those boxes. That being said, Texas takes it a step further. In Texas, there is no individual income tax or corporate income tax, so the state welcomes both workers and companies. South and North Carolina have relatively low income taxes too, which is also a huge draw to the area. One thing becomes clear when looking at the trends between which states people are leaving and which states are seeing an increase in residents. The majority of people are migrating from states with high taxes to states with zero or minimal income tax. When you think about it, this all makes sense, and you might be wondering why it took until now for people to make such a move. Most analysts suspect it has a lot to do with the pandemic and how it shifted what was important to people. City life was fun until it wasn't, and once people started realizing that there were opportunities outside of the uber-expensive urban centers in the United States, they took advantage of it. Remote work also likely played a role in people reassessing what they wanted in the place where they lived. Being able to afford a house or condo that was large enough to give families space at an affordable rate started to become more desirable than a cramped apartment in the hip neighborhood of a bustling city. In spite of this, though, you'll soon see that financial reasons are not the only reason people wanted to move. More and more people moving out of major cities and the states that house them are doing so not for job opportunities, but for personal reasons. In fact, many households that are leaving urban areas and heading to other states have admitted to taking a sizable pay cut. This just shows that job opportunities are not the only thing driving the migration of US residents out of cities, and that something else is going on. Recent surveys showed that moving to be closer to family is now just 0.7% behind work-related movers. Moving to be closer to family has actually increased by almost 13% since 2015, at which point it was a massive 41% behind work-related moves. The gap between the two has now closed to less than 1%, indicating that it's not just populations shifting in the United States, but the reasons for why they're moving are changing as well. Now, for the moment you've been waiting for. What is the biggest reason why people are leaving cities and certain states? Like many things, it all comes down to money. Unless you make a ton of money, living in a city can be hard. Housing is expensive, food is expensive, taxes are expensive. There are just a lot of different everyday things that suck the money right out of your bank account. Let's look at several major cities and see what a $100,000 salary feels like in each. You might be thinking, doesn't a $100,000 salary get you $100,000 a year? Not necessarily. Making six figures in New York City is like making minimum wage in many other parts of the United States. Analysts and financial advisors have calculated that a $100,000 salary in New York City feels like making $35,000 in other parts of the US. There are a couple of reasons for this. The first is that if you live in New York City, you are paying federal taxes, New York state taxes, and New York City taxes. So your $100,000 is being taxed by 3 different government entities. Then there's the expensive cost of living, but it's $3,500 a month apartments, which make things really expensive. For this amount of rent, you are likely getting a studio about the size of a broom closet. If we break this down further, the federal, state, and city government keeps around 25% of a New Yorker's paycheck, meaning your $100,000 salary is immediately cut to $75,000. Then you spend $42,000 a year on rent, so the $75,000 becomes $33,000. Inflated grocery prices mean you likely spend around $150 a week just to keep yourself alive. So you can see how quickly $100,000 disappears. Therefore, it's unsurprising that many people are fleeing New York City and its expensive cost of living for a cheaper part of the country. In Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, California, $100,000 ends up feeling more like $45,000 due to the high cost of housing, groceries, utilities, transportation, and other goods and services. But when we look at cities in Texas, things start to become a little better, which is one of the reasons why people are moving to the state. In Houston and San Antonio, $100,000 ends up feeling close to $80,000 a year. However, other than the unsustainable nature of living in US cities, what is terrifying about these numbers is that the people who are moving out can afford to do so. People who are struggling to make ends meet don't have the ability to pack up and move their whole lives to a new state, which means they're stuck in a city that is quickly eating away at their savings and weekly paychecks. Since large cities such as New York and LA rely heavily on their tax base to fund social programs, things are going to get even harder for people as wealthy and middle-class residents leave these areas. As these populations move out, their money goes with them, which is a serious cause for concern as already underfunded infrastructure and welfare programs will become even harder to obtain for those who need them most. However, it's also interesting to note that the cities are not the only areas seeing an increase in people moving out. Suburbs that surround these major urban hubs are also starting to suffer. In the past, when movement into cities decreased, there seemed to be an increase in the suburbs surrounding those cities. However, nowadays, people aren't leaving New York City and moving to commuter towns. They're leaving the region entirely. The same can be said about LA, Chicago, San Francisco, and many other major cities that are losing both their urban and suburban residents. Recent data suggests that although the suburbs aren't losing new residents at the same rate as cities, there has also been a steady decrease in people moving to suburbs that are directly outside of metropolitan areas. A lot of this has to do with the cost of living in many urban suburbs becoming almost as unsustainable as the cities themselves. However, all of the reasons that people are moving from major cities to smaller communities in places like Florida, Texas, and the Carolinas also apply to the people in major urban suburbs who are moving to get to these places as well. There are just more affordable homes and better incentives in the southern states. It's the desire to live someplace where your bank account isn't being squeezed into oblivion by heavy taxes and super high home prices that's drawing people south. And for many Americans, this is much more important than living near a major city or a part of the country they grew up in. Obviously, this isn't true for everyone, and there are definitely people from the South moving to big cities in the Northeast and West, but not to the same extent that residents of cities and their surrounding suburbs are moving out. The suburbs are definitely not losing residents as quickly as their nearby city centers. However, between 2019 and 2021, 43 out of the 56 major metro area suburbs either saw a dip in growth or an increase in the number of residents they were losing. This means that 77% of suburbs around major cities may see serious migrations out of the area in the coming years. The number of major metro suburban areas that experienced population loss has more than tripled over the past decade. So even suburbs that are only experiencing a decline in population growth could soon find themselves scrambling to come up with ways to bring more residents in. Because, let's be honest, a deserted suburb with boarded-up windows and run-down properties will likely not be the first place people will want to move to. It's worth noting again that the mass exodus out of cities into less populated regions in the South might just be an anomaly. However, what appears to be a constant over the past 2 decades is that the number of people moving into major cities is on the decline. So much has changed with advances in technology, allowing some employees to work from anywhere in the world. Then there's the fact that corporations themselves have even begun moving out of cities to more corporate-friendly areas that have lower tax rates or, at the very least, have offered tax breaks for businesses. The never-ending increase in the cost of living in cities like New York, DC, Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles just isn't sustainable for many. Millennials and the generations that follow, who have been putting off having a family, are now looking to start one. Taking care of yourself in a major city is a nearly impossible financial task, but raising a child on a modest or even somewhat high salary is all but hopeless, depending on where you live. This is another factor that heavily impacts the money conversation, drawing people out of city life and causing them to move to states and areas where they can actually afford a property that will allow their family to grow. It begs the question, though, is this a uniquely American experience, or do we see similar trends around the world? Interestingly, what we're seeing in the United States is not the norm for other parts of the world. Around 55% of the world's population is estimated to live in or around urban centers. This statistic is expected to increase to about 68% by the year 2050. This means that in many countries across the planet, more and more people will be moving to cities, which could result in an additional 2.5 billion people living in urban areas in the next 3 decades. To be clear, 90% of this increase will be seen in Asian and African cities, according to the United Nations. The UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs predicts that the growth of urban populations will actually be concentrated in only a few countries. India, China, and Nigeria will make up 35% of the projected urban growth between 2018 and 2050. It's projected that India alone will add 416 million urban residents by 2050. China will see an increase of 255 million city inhabitants, and Nigerian cities will grow by 189 million people. However, it's important to note that other cities outside of the United States have seen a decline in population as well, but for different reasons. Many of the urban centers that are currently experiencing population decline are directly linked to an overall decline in the country's population. Nations experiencing low fertility rates in Asia and Europe, where overall populations are either stagnating or already declining, have seen their urban populations shrinking. For example, Nagasaki in Japan and Busan in South Korea have had shrinking populations since the year 2000. Countries and their urban centers in Eastern Europe, such as Poland, Romania, and Ukraine, have also witnessed their populations decrease since 2000 as well. The United States population is still growing, but not at a sustainable rate. In 1961, the population growth rate of the US was around 1.7%. By 1974, the growth rate fell to around 1%. However, this was still sustainable, as there was another hike in growth rate on the horizon. In 1992, the population growth rate was back up to 1.4%. Since then, the growth rate has declined steadily until 2019, when it sat at around 0.5%. Then, like with so many other things, the pandemic caused chaos in US population growth. In 2021, the population growth actually crashed to 0.1%. If this trend continues, it won't take long before the total population of the United States starts to decline. It's probable that this will further exacerbate the already decreasing populations in US cities, which could have detrimental effects on certain parts of the country. To be fair, it's not all doom and gloom for US cities. Many smaller cities are seeing an influx of residents, although it's pretty clear that even the thriving small cities tend to be concentrated in certain areas. Out of the 5 cities with the largest percentage growth in recent years, all of them are located in 2 states. In Arizona, Queen Creek and Buckeye are 2 small cities that are seeing an increase in movers, while in Texas, San Antonio, Leander, and New Braunfels are on the list. Then comes cities with the largest positive numerical changes. Here we see San Antonio, Texas, and Phoenix, Arizona, gaining over 13,000 residents in 2021. Fort Worth, Texas gained just under 13,000 new residents, and Port St. Lucie in Florida and North Las Vegas, Nevada each gained around 10,000 new residents. As you can see, even the cities that are growing in population are in the south. This leads to an inevitable conclusion. Both large and small cities in the north and along the coast seem to be in trouble. There are undoubtedly many smaller cities in these regions that are still seeing population growth, but none of them could claim the same gains as these small southern cities. Again, a lot of this has to do with the cost of living, job opportunities, and taxes. Some of it might have to do with the quality of life and the benefit of having more warm and sunny days throughout the year. In the coming decades, state and local governments will need to closely monitor the change in residential numbers in their cities and towns. If there aren't more incentives for people to stay in cities or to at least remain within major suburbs, it could lead to a serious population decline in many of the US's most important economic hubs. The future likely won't hold a Hollywood Boulevard devoid of people or a Times Square with nothing but flashing lights and windswept garbage passing through it. But if the current trends continue, major cities could run into a number of funding problems and a lack of skilled labor. Then again, perhaps the mass movements of Americans to the south will drive the cost of living up in this region, and we'll see a return to major cities in the northeast and west in the future. What it comes down to is that people will live wherever they can be happy while making enough money to live comfortably. Thanks for watching. Feel free to check out our other videos, such as why one of the USA's biggest lakes is reappearing centuries after disappearing. Or another one on the real reason the United States bought Alaska from Russia. Thanks for watching. Have you noticed that there aren't many new highways being built in the United States? Actually, there's none. The last highway built in the US was the 12.5-mile segment of Interstate 70 that runs through Glenwood Canyon in Colorado. That highway was completed and opened in October of 1992. Since then, there's been nothing. No new highways, not even new portions of highways. Why? Is it just about the money? Not exactly. Adjusted for inflation, the interstate highway system cost the US $618 billion to build. It's a high sum, but certainly not enough to stop more construction. There are other reasons why we're not getting new highways, and we're gonna break every single one of them down in this video. And surprise, it's not all about taxes and the cost of building. The first reason is that the United States is far more focused on maintaining its network of highways than it is on expanding it. You've probably seen this yourself when you're driving. The telltale road work ahead signs that bring you to a crawl are responsible for 24% of non-recurring delays in traffic. That maintenance is also a money sink. In 2019, Transportation for America said the US will need just over $230 billion per year over the next 6 years just to keep America's existing roads working properly. Why is so much money spent on maintenance? Well, a large part of the reason comes down to the aging highway infrastructure. Even the newest stretch of American highway is over 30 years old and has seen millions of cars drive along its roads. That stretch of highway accounts for just 12.5 miles of a 40,000-mile network that started construction following the passing of the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act. Some stretches of American highways are even older than that act. The first highway, dubbed the National Road, started construction in 1811 and ran for 820 miles through 6 states. The point is that there are a lot of roads that need maintenance in the US highway system. Those roads are taking a constant battering from the elements. Combine water, sunlight, and natural oxidation, and you have 3 powerful elemental punches that can slowly destroy the roads. Rain mixed with snow and ice places American highways under constant pressure. The average annual rainfall in the US was 29.5 inches in 2023, and that includes snow, hail, and other water-based elemental threats. That's 29.5 inches of water that seeps into weakened road-based layers, causing cracks and potholes. The ultraviolet rays that hit American highways thanks to natural sunlight slowly dissolve the asphalt used in modern roads. Even the oxygen we breathe is a problem. It breaks down asphalt to the point where the material becomes even more susceptible to cracking. Add a constant flow of vehicles rumbling over it, and you have a recipe for faltering infrastructure. The US has dedicated $110 billion to improving its roads as part of the Investment and Jobs Act, but that's all money that isn't going toward the construction of new highways. Still, surely there's enough money to cover repairs and new highway construction. The US government collected almost $4.4 trillion from taxes and other revenue in fiscal year 2024 alone. Couldn't some of that cash go toward new roads? It could, but there are other reasons why we're not seeing new highways. Regulatory and environmental challenges also impact highway construction. Any new highways have to meet a minimum lane width of 12 feet, have a minimum of 4-foot paved shoulder on the left and a 10-foot shoulder on the right. Then, when there's 3 lanes in both directions, the shoulder width rises to 10 feet on either side. That may not seem like much, but it reveals that even a single new road requires a lot of land to build. If that new highway stretches for several hundred miles, a state or states will have to sacrifice vast tracts of land to allow for new highway construction. Putting that aside for now, though, we'll come back to land acquisition in a moment. There are also environmental factors at play in highway construction. The Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, points to the Coastal Zone Act Reauthorization Amendments, or CZARA, of 1990 as a big reason why new highways aren't being built. CZARA is designed to minimize the runoff into America's coastal waters, 21% of which is already susceptible to both land-to-sea and sea-to-land contamination, according to NASA. The EPA says improper road planning can contribute to these pollution problems, so any organization that even considers new highway construction has to avoid building their roads in any area that could affect American coasts or wetlands. But that's not all. They have to consider how water drains, how the soil responds, the local climate, and even the shape of the land before a single bulldozer is revved up. These are long-winded and expensive processes that likely deter the US from even considering building new highways. It already costs $1.25 million per mile to simply mill and resurface a 4-lane road. So the billions it would cost to build a new one that meets existing regulations, it's simply too much. There are also regular inspections to consider. If we hone in on bridges, 83% of highway bridges are inspected by the Department of Transportation, or DOT, every 2 years. Annual inspections are carried out for 12% of bridges. Each of those inspections costs money, and any new highway has to pass these rigorous inspections. That's just another expensive hurdle standing in the way of construction. Standards are only getting stricter. The 2007 collapse of the I-35 West Bridge in Minneapolis, which involved 111 vehicles, shows that the DOT is still trying to get its inspection routines right. More regulations have to be put in place to ensure the existing crumbling highway system is up to standard before new roads can even be considered. Despite these barriers, there are still some plans for new highway developments. Interstate 99, which should run between southern New York and central Pennsylvania, sits in a partially completed state thanks to massive flooding and issues arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. There are many others still in the proposal stages, so the US is at least trying to get extensions to its existing highway system off the ground. So, what are other problems stopping it? Apart from the cost and regulatory issues of building a new highway, there's also the land acquisition problem. The extensive amounts of land the DOT and other state and federal organizations need to build highways has to be bought and properly assigned for highway usage. It then has to get by a general public that is often not happy to see a highway being built or expanded. In April of 2022, a group of Texan citizens took to the streets to protest a $9 billion project to widen and realign several of the city's major highways. Those plans, claimed the protesters, would force the displacement of thousands of people from their homes, as well as destroying hundreds of schools, businesses, and even local churches. Texas Governor Greg Abbott argued that Texas needs the highway expansions to help it handle the explosive population growth it's experienced over the last few years. At the time of the protests, Texas was growing at a rate of 1,100 people per day. According to Abbott, those people need new highways, but they also need places to live and work. Any new highway that's built needs to sacrifice the latter for the former. Texas's I-45 project alone will force the displacement of 1,200 people, with City Limits author Megan Kimball noting that most of those displaced are people of color. Not only are there land acquisition problems to face when building new highways, but also social issues that require confronting. And these are only the problems a single state faces because it wants to expand its highways. Building a brand new road comes with these same problems and more. There's the sheer cost of acquiring land, for instance. The cost of a single acre in America averages out to almost $18,500. Naturally, the price varies depending on the state. In California, an acre costs over $24,500, whereas you can pick up the same amount of land in Arizona for about half as much. Still, there's a clear cost burden at play here. Assuming we have a 6-lane highway road, the regulations state that each lane has to be 12 feet wide. That creates a total of 72 feet. With 3 lanes in each direction, there also needs to be 20 feet of paved shoulders on each side of the highway. This adds up to 40 feet, giving us a total approximate width of 112 feet. This hypothetical highway is just 0.02 miles wide. Now, when we stretch that over the 12.5-mile segment of I-70 we mentioned earlier, you end up with about 0.26 square miles of land. Doesn't sound like much, right? But when you convert that to acres, you get 166 acres. Multiply that by the average land cost of almost $18,558 per acre, and you're staring at a land acquisition price tag of over $3 million for a tiny stretch of highway. And remember, that's before planning, construction, and all the other costs kick in. If that land includes housing, like it often does in Texas, you can kiss your budget goodbye. But let's say a prospective highway builder has the money to buy the land and build the highway. They're all set, right? Not necessarily. As the 2022 protests in Texas showcased, that highway builder still has to deal with space constraints. Governor Abbott may be willing to displace thousands of people, but those people don't want to be moved. That's a situation you'll see all over the US as new highway construction has to be balanced against urban sprawl and growing populations. Those protesting Texans aren't the only ones who want highway builders to take a break either. In February of 2024, a coalition of almost 200 groups was calling for the US to create a nationwide moratorium on expanding the existing highway system. Those groups argue that highways, and the cars that use them, create an environmental nightmare for the country. American vehicles combined to generate 370 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2022 alone, with the addition of more highways only likely to worsen that emissions problem. Combine those climate-related issues with the displacement that occurs when trying to build highways through densely populated urban areas, and you have a recipe for protests that slow construction down to a crawl. All of which brings us to our next reason why new highways aren't being built in the United States. America's collective transportation needs are changing. The majority of American voters would much rather see the money that could go toward new highways spent on more public transportation options in their cities. 71% of American voters believe more funding should go to public transport at the expense of new highways. However, they're being forced to watch as investment into highways outstrips money going into trains, buses, and similar forms of transportation at a ratio of $4 to $1. There's certainly a return on investment that comes from spending more on public transport. Public transit provides a 5-to-1 return, and that it's better for the environment too. It currently saves 37 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year in the US. That's around a tenth of what vehicles generate annually. The carbon conscious will point to that as reason enough to spend less on highways. Other changes in vehicle usage and ownership may also make highways increasingly obsolete. Attitudes toward vehicles are starting to shift. About a third of Americans say they'd be willing to ditch car ownership altogether by 2030, with 18% saying they're very likely to do so. The rise of ride-sharing apps such as Uber may play a part in this, as could the increasing appetite for public transit mentioned earlier. Even though household car ownership rose between 2015 and 2022, the sheer number of vehicles on American roads has declined over the last 3 decades. America was home to 136 million vehicles in 1995. That number peaked in 2001 with 138 million before starting a steady decline to take us to just under 100 million in 2022. These figures suggest that households are increasingly moving away from owning more than one car. Fewer cars means less demand for new highways. So, where does all of this leave the US when it comes to its highways? There are new projects in the works, but they're constantly beset with delays related to costs and opposition from the general public. Maintenance of existing highways is a greater priority than building new ones. Plus, there's a clear emerging trend toward public transit and fewer cars on the roads, which make it even harder to justify the expense of building new highways. Money gained from taxes isn't the issue. Instead, there's a cavalcade of challenges that makes building new highways not worth the time or effort required. But what do you think? Should the US build more highways? And if so, why? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching and take care out there.